Hey, what's up? It's Cute What If. This side. Today we will be seeing what if Deku became the hacker vigilante. Before we move ahead with the FIC, leave a like and subscribe to the channel for future what ifs like this. Izuku glanced down at his phone under his desk, counting the seconds until the bell went off, signaling the end of the day. If he was fast enough, he might even be able to avoid. And there was the familiar sharp ding of the bell. Since his stuff was already in his backpack, it was simple to just sprint out the door. Bakugo had already started the chase, but Izuku was used to the cat and mouse they had played for years, and stayed away from sharp corners. His chaser was quick to orient himself on those and Izuku wasn't, so it was best to find a straight way to run along. The yells and curses behind him increased when Izuku jumped into an alleyway and kept up his jog, though they faded as he increased the distance between them. He'd faced off and seen many people that were technically scarier than his childhood friend, but his heart never did quite pound in quiet fear as it did when he was chased by Bakugo. His heart and breath slowed down once he saw his destination up ahead. The internet cafe he had been frequenting recent was small but cozy, and the black, silver, and purple color scheme it had going on was a welcome sight every day after school, especially after his daily escapes from Bakugo. You're back," a voice called from near the counter. A tall person with bright-colored green hair that was just now changing to a light orange waved at him, smiling. Tomomi had been working at Musei Cafe for as long as Izuku had been going there, and they always left a cookie or two aside for him when he came by. The cafe doubled as both a place to eat and get Wi-Fi that couldn't be traced, of which Izuku was thankful for in equal amounts. After getting his usual cookie from Tomomi, he settled back into the inconspicuous corner he was used to sitting in. It didn't have the most comfortable cushions, but it did keep people from peering over his shoulder or just noticing him overall, which was his goal. Can't keep your secret identity a secret if everyone is always looking at you, right? The cushions sunk down with him when he sat in it. The laptop he kept on him at most times despite how heavy it was brought out quickly, and then he set to work checking the cameras around the city. The east side of the city was doing okay today. The drag ring bust last week had seemed to mellow out that part of the city, though it would perk up soon, he could tell. A mugging near the park had him sending off a quick message to the officers near that area, and a few fights got the same treatment. Once that area looked good, he switched to the south side. It had been too quiet lately, and what that usually meant was a bank being robbed. Izuku counted 4 villains, though they all looked like they had just started their looting. He checked the inside cameras, and it seemed like no one had notified the heroes yet. There were 2 hostages, though they didn't appear to be very scared. One of them even checked his watch. Living in a superhuman society did strange things to people's reactions to danger. It was easy for Izuku to slip his computer back in his backpack and quietly slink into the bathroom deep in the cafe. Once he opened the door, he quickly checked the room for any cameras in the vicinity. There never were any in this room, but it didn't hurt to look. If he had learned anything from this whole situation, it was that people hid cameras in places you would never think to look. Luckily, the room was empty this time. The last time it had not had been a fun experience. He had run out of the room before the person could ask any questions, however. Izuku found the first empty stall that he saw and quickly shut and locked the door. Pulling out the small mirror he kept on him at all times and liquid eyeliner, he set to work applying his usual mask. 2 large wings, paired with the black face mask with a point-toothed smile, changed his appearance more than one would think, and successfully had kept his identity hidden for as long as he had been doing this. The final touch was the black sneakers that he switched out from his usual bright red ones. They were way too distinctive, almost as much as his hair, although he couldn't do much about the latter. Now that his disguise was done, he could leave for the scene of the crime. Going back out the way he came was out of the question, so he would take his usual route, the window. If there were ever times Izuku was glad he was short, it was ones like these. Once he had wiggled through the window, which had luckily not been too high up, he checked his phone for the exact location of the bank. After he memorized it, Izuku tucked his phone in his pocket, straightened up, and ran. One of the things he had taught himself over time was the layout of the city. If there was an alley, he had walked in it. If there was a roof, he had jumped across it. One thing that often baffled people was how quickly he usually got to the scene. Some minimal parkour skills also helped. Even if the first few times he had tried it he had ended up almost falling off a roof. That was a fun thing to try and explain to his mom. Izuku was lucky that he had good balance, or the several pipes he had to climb combined with the roof jumping would surely have been the end of him. He would never quite get rid of the lingering feeling of falling as he leapt to one high place to the next, however. A few minutes were all he needed to make his way towards his location. Izuku peered over the half-wall from on top of the roof of the building across the street from the bank. Though he didn't really need to be near the crime scene, the cameras in the bank had not been clear enough for Izuku to see exactly what was happening inside. He also may or may not have wanted to get on the scene and feel like a real hero, but that was besides the point. When he gets as comfortable as you can in black skinny jeans on a concrete rooftop, Izuku opened his laptop and opened up the personal hotspot that he had bought for himself. It would be easier and cheaper to hack into the Wi-Fi down below him, but every time Izuku did, he would feel guilty for days afterward. Once he was hooked up, all he had to do was send the location along with some details to the nearest police and heroes. After the location was sent, he squinted down at the building across from him and started the mumble storm that helped him dissect the situation. 2 mutant quirks, 1 jaguar and 1 octopus. Fire quirk might work best against those. 2 unidentified quirks? No, he just produced a knife from his hand, 1 unidentified quirk. Fire and possibly speed quirk would be best in this situation. Izuku rambled on in a constant stream under his breath. The closest fire heroes in this area would be Endeavor and Flamethrower, though this was too much of a small job for one of the top heroes to deal with at the moment. He couldn't think of anyone off the bat who could easily combat a speed quirk, and the knife quirk could be handled by Flamethrower. Maybe a combination of 2 quirks? A water to slow down along with some sort of fish quirk might work, though it might make things harder for Flamethrower. Once he made up his mind, Izuku sent off the message to the station and notified the heroes he needed to. Flamethrower, Aquatic, and Chomp would have to work, as they were the closest heroes at the moment. It wasn't the best matchup, but if they could separate tentacles from the others it should be an easy fight. He said as much to the police and heroes before checking the time. Did he have enough time to watch the fight, or? Oh, that was a no. If he wanted to catch the other robbery on the upper end of the east side, he definitely had to run now. Snapping his computer shut with one forlorn look shot towards the fight that had already started in front of the bank, Izuku put everything away and readied himself to continue his trek across the city. Although his legs had already started to slightly burn from all the jumping, he smiled. Izuku was glad to help the city he lived in. It was all he could do. When Izuku finally got home, it was mostly dark, save for the light purple tint on some parts of the sky. He had stopped at a public bathroom on his way home, so his eyes were eyeliner-free, save for the small clumps near his eyelashes. He never figured out the trick to getting those out, even though he had been doing his own makeup for 3 whole years. He was lucky his mom hadn't noticed yet. "Mom," he called out into the seemingly empty space. He wasn't left waiting for long, as his mom quickly appeared seemingly out of nowhere to greet him. "Izuku," she cried out, and latched onto him in a hug. Although she saw him every day, she still disliked to when he was gone until dark, especially after that incident. "Izuku, I was so worried, I thought we agreed to not stay out past 6:00. Izuku barely flinched and chanced a glance to the wall clock, confirming that he had been out later than he thought. "And I was just so worried. Please don't do this again, please, baby?" All Izuku could do was nod in confirmation before Inko buried her face in the side of his neck in another hug. He could feel himself wilting internally at the sight, and made sure to squeeze her just as hard back. Mom, it's okay, I'm okay, I promise." He quickly assured her, and his words seemed to comfort her as she let him go a while after he had started apologizing. After they had both calmed themselves, Inko led Izuku to the kitchen to eat the dinner he had almost missed out on. The katsudon she had made him was cold, but he ate it anyways for his mom. The TV was on in the living room still. He assumed she had been watching it in stress before he got home, and paused in his eating when he heard something the reporter was saying. It seems that once again, the police had been helped by the anonymous coding Vigilante, antivirus. He notified nearby heroes to 3 robberies and 4 break-ins. Izuku tuned the rest out after that. Hearing himself on the TV had a certain kind of effect on people, it seemed. He had to hide his smile in the bowl of cold katsudon, although it tasted much better now. When Izuku is 4 years old, his world falls apart. Not literally, of course, although in the moment the doctor tells him and his mother about how he'll never develop a quirk, the latter seems almost preferable. Life goes downhill after that. What little friendship Izuku had managed with Bakugo has collapsed, and the bullying has only increased. It's not out of place to see a certain green-haired boy frantically running through the halls, explosions trailing in his wake. However, today was a slightly different story. Izuku had hid as soon as the bell had rung, signaling the end of his first day of middle school. After what he estimated as an hour had passed, he crept out of the cabinet that he'd previously been lodged in. Bakugo was faster than him, so Izuku had taken to hiding as opposed to his usual running tactic. He was lucky it had worked this time. Last time had resulted in a few scorched bathroom walls and a handle-shaped bruise on his back. Izuku peered out of the classroom that had been his hideout. The hallways looked empty, so he slunk quietly down them towards the doors at the front of the school. He was so close. Izuku threw himself through the nearest open door when he heard a pair of approaching voices around the corner. And that part when she hacked into all the cameras dash, one of the teacher's voices carried into the classroom Izuku was currently hiding in. Oh, I love that part. How long did it take her to learn to hack again dash? The second teacher chimed in. Their voices faded after the two teachers walked past the classroom Izuku was hiding in. Only when he could no longer hear their footsteps did he let out the breath he had been holding. He didn't want to get caught and reprimanded for lingering after school hours, after all. As Izuku finally left the school building and started walking home, he thought back a bit to the conversation he'd accidentally eavesdropped on. He hadn't heard of a quirk called hacking before. In fact, no matter how thoroughly he racked his brain, nothing turned up. Curiosity made him get out his phone and type up the words, hacking quirk. Izuku clicked the search button and prepared to scroll, only to blink blankly at the no results symbol that popped up. Confused, he typed it in again a few different ways, only to get the same result each time. Eventually, he typed in just hacking by itself. At least that got results. Apparently hacking, or coding, was a skill that people could learn as opposed to a quirk. As Izuku scrolled through the pages, he got more and more intrigued. Although he couldn't save people if he learned how to hack, he would have something to do after school. Writing a note in his phone before putting it back in his pocket and picking up the pace towards his house, Izuku felt not that much different than usual. Then again, he could never have predicted the effect a single overheard conversation would have on his fate. The first time Izuku hacks for anything other than fun or practice, it was out of necessity. It was around 6 p.m. when he stumbled on a villain attack. There was no crowd, unlike most fights that he'd been to before. A villain with pure glowing blue eyes seemed to be controlling the pieces of debris around them with their mind. So far, no hero was on the scene. Izuku made himself comfortable near a park bench barely hidden behind a large piece of cement that had landed near it, and waited for a hero to show up. Unfortunately, it didn't seem like anyone was coming anytime soon. 15 minutes after the villain attack had started, Izuku, along with what looked like a family of 3 and 2 couples, were still the only ones on the scene. It was apparent that no one had phoned a hero or the police either. Guess it was up to him. Izuku got out his phone and prepared to dial the authorities, but hesitated at the last second. The police would take a long time to get there as they were way on the other side of the city, and likely wouldn't get to the scene in time. But what else could he do? It wasn't like he could just tell the closest heroes where the crime was. Actually, he could. Izuku felt his eyes widen in realization before he unlocked his phone and set to work. If he could get through the phones of the nearest heroes, he could tell them to come help. It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the fastest thing he could come up with for now. He sent off a simple message, the address of the park he was at, as well as a few details about the villain that seemed to have taken a couple hostage. Izuku hastily added that part too. He then put his phone back in his backpack and began to wait anxiously. Luck was on his side that day, as the heroes arrived on the scene quickly. The fight was quick, and Izuku only had to take a few extra notes before it ended. Everyone cleared up the area shortly after the villain was cuffed and taken away. The walk home felt nicer than it usually did. The knowledge that he had helped people kept his feet and heart light. Izuku was feeling large amounts of déjà vu at the moment. Again, he was one of the first on a crime scene that the heroes or police had yet to arrive at. The situation went mostly the same way that it did the first time. A quick message to the nearby heroes and all was well. Izuku put away his phone again and thought nothing of it. Or he wouldn't have, if it hadn't happened again. And again. And again. By the third time that something similar had happened, he had noticed a pattern. The fourth and up times had just been confirming hunches of his. A major problem with the hero patrols that rolled through every day was that they couldn't be everywhere at once. Certain areas were left less protected than others, such as poor areas, while upper-class neighborhoods would often be guarded with more heroes than necessary. He had a good idea as to why. After Izuku was repeatedly proven correct, he took it upon himself to patrol the areas the heroes sometimes skipped over, and it seemed to be working. However, as time went on, he realized that he couldn't possibly cover all the areas that heroes didn't. That was the moment the idea struck him. Why did he have to do everything on foot? Cameras were easy to locate and get into, and he could cover much more ground quicker that way. Cameras were also everywhere. Even the streets had cameras in the form of traffic cams. In a pinch, he could hack into someone's phone if he needed to. He never could quite get rid of the thrill of being in the middle of the scene, though, so he came up with a simple disguise in case anyone might happen to see him. The mask was a plain one that he bought at the nearest store, and the eyeliner had originated from a tutorial he'd seen on how much it would change his eye shape. Better to be safe than sorry on that account, even if it did take him a long time to perfect. So began Izuku's first foray into the world of crime. Just as every hero or villain had a name to go by, Izuku was no exception, though the way in which he got his was probably not the most common. In the end, he wasn't the one to come up with it. The newest anonymous coding vigilante has once again tipped off the local police to a crime scene. The burning building was luckily put out before much damage could be done. The TV reporter droned on from the living room. Izuku wasn't paying very much attention until he heard himself mentioned, so he quickly tuned in. The reporter with several striped snakes for hair had since moved on from the actual event and was currently hosting an impromptu interview with a policeman that had been near the scene at the time. The green-skinned man was talking about how helpful the hacker had been recently in getting to scenes recently. He's really helping us out right now, you know? Almost like that thing you download to your computer to help get rid of a virus? Antivirus, right? He's like that, the man rambled on a bit. The reporter blinked back at him once, snakes included, before smiling and turning back towards the camera and carrying on with what she had been talking about before. Anyways, the newest vigilante, antivirus, is to thank for the solving of today's latest crime. And then the station moved on. It took a few seconds for the fact that he had just been given a name to work under to process. When it did hit, however, it hit hard. Izuku was an accomplished vigilante. He was on the news. If he was ever caught, he would be arrested. That was all pretty amazing if he thought about it. Except for that last part, but he would think about that later. It was his first day of high school. Izuku could have tried to get into UA, but with his part-time job of being almost a hero, he didn't feel the need anymore. He had nothing to prove to Bakugo or anyone, not when he helped people every day already. In a weird sort of way, his after-school activities had been a form of therapy for him that he didn't know he needed. As he stood outside the building that he had been accepted to, Izuku breathed in once before letting it out. The past 3 years had been crazy, but he had a good feeling about this one. His first in-person job of the school year came quickly that same day. Although both sides of the city were extremely quiet today, it looked like there was a villain fight going on in the park on the east side. Parks were the places he had to visit himself most often, as there were rarely any cameras in them. Luckily for him, a food stand with a paranoid owner had a camera installed in it, so it had an okay enough view of the fight. Still, he couldn't make out much. It took him a minute or two to arrive at the scene. He had gotten progressively better at roof hopping over the years, and it never took him more than 15 minutes to get anywhere. Something was off about the fight when he got near it. For one thing, he couldn't actually see the villains, only hear them. Another thing was the lack of crowd, which usually happened whenever a crime was happening. Instead of getting close to the fight like he usually would, Izuku selected a tree to hide in. His dark green hoodie and hair would blend in well enough, even if it would be a bit precarious to balance his computer in his lap. The setup was a quick one. The nearest heroes were a street or two away, so it wouldn't be too hard to get them there quickly. He froze. The noise from earlier had stopped, and the entire park was silent. Memories from that incident flashed quickly in his mind like a flame, but were snuffed out just as quickly. This was nothing like that, he told himself mentally, hand coming up to gently rub the hand-shaped scar on his chest through his clothes. He kept quiet for a bit longer before shifting his position so as to have a better view of the park. The motion unfortunately caused the leaves to rustle, and the next thing he knew, a loud sound shot straight in front of his face. Izuku jerked back reflexively, but in doing so fell out of the tree he was perched in. The last thing he heard was someone's tired voice calling out how they weren't supposed to hurt him, idiot, just catch him, before his head hit the ground and his vision went dark. When Izuku woke up, it was in a bed that wasn't his own. The gray sheets and nailed-to-the-wall bed frame were the first clear indications that this wasn't his room. The next things that showed him that something was off were the gray walls that were way too close to him. The last and final thing that helped him realize where he was the guard planted outside his cell. It took Izuku about 4 seconds to process all this, another 2 seconds to start his mental breakdown, and around 15 seconds before he realized that the guard was trying to get his attention through a series of awkward coughs. Once Izuku turned toward the three-eyed guard, she perked up and opened her mouth to speak. He subconsciously noted that she had pointed teeth before listening to what she had to say. "Please come with me, sir," the guard said in a low voice before stepping out of the small room. Izuku could see a hallway through the open doorway from his vantage point of the bed. The sheets crumpled underneath him as he stood up, and Izuku was thankful that they had been considerate enough to give him a bed before the door was slammed behind him as he exited the cell. The pair walked in silence. Izuku was thankful when they finally arrived outside a large metal door. The door opened with a loud screech as metal moved against metal. He found himself flinching at the noise before being shoved into the room when he made no move to do it himself. The door was again shut behind him, so Izuku took the time to look around the room that he currently locked in. Everything was gray, like it had been in his cell. There was a table in the center of the room that looked like it was nailed to the floor, and it had 2 chairs on either side. From what Izuku had seen from shows and movies, with a slightly heavy feeling in his stomach, he concluded that the room was possibly the most cliché interrogation room that could have existed. Looking around the room for cameras and shocked to find none, Izuku decided that the large mirror on one wall was probably a two-way mirror. Curling in on himself a bit knowing he was being watched, Izuku hurriedly sat down at the metal table. The most logical thing to do at the moment was lie. He couldn't afford his identity getting out at the moment, or it would surely be tracked back to his mom. Izuku briefly felt himself getting lightheaded at the thought of his mom getting hurt somehow because of his actions, but pushed the thought aside to focus. By the time the door was heaved open once again, Izuku had a plan. Answer nothing and lie when he had to. Don't link anything back to himself, and most importantly, don't lead anything back to his mom. Unfortunately, his entire plan went out the window once he saw who had come to interrogate him. The head of the police force, Naomasa Tsukachi, renowned for his truth-telling quirk, walked into the room with a small smile on his face. It was probably a tactic to get Izuku to loosen up and get comfortable, though he was certainly doing the opposite as he felt his plans burn to ash. Naomasa, oblivious to his inner turmoil, sat down across from him. The same smile stayed plastered on his face the whole time. It would have looked real to most people, but Izuku had been faking his own smiles to the world for years. For him, it was easy to spot a forced one. "Well, I guess you already know why you're here," the detective broke the silence that had settled. Izuku nodded mutely in reply, afraid to say anything at all. Something flickered behind Naomasa's eyes when he didn't say anything. Annoyance? Pity? Izuku wasn't sure, and didn't particularly want to know either. Naomasa cleared his throat before shuffling the papers he had brought in with him. He made eye contact as he started talking again. "So, first things first. What's your name?" He cut straight to the point. Izuku shifted in his seat, eyes on his lap, before muttering out his name. Naomasa nodded to himself as he wrote it down on the papers on the table. Izuku felt like had sold a piece of himself to the devil. Are there any other people working with you? The next question caught him by surprise. So much so, in fact, that he jerked his head up to meet Naomasa's eyes as he denied the question. No, there isn't, he said to Naomasa, who looked slightly shocked at the answer. For a moment, he let the cool facade he'd been keeping up the whole time to drop. It's only me, Izuku added when the detective stayed silent. Naomasa seemed to snap back into reality to that as he went back to write another thing down. Izuku couldn't read the writing from where he was, despite his attempts. What's your quirk? Was what Naomasa's next question was. He looked like he already knew the answer by the way he phrased it, but Izuku was an expert at disappointing people. He tried out, having to wet his lips as he forced the words out. I'm quirkless. The room was silent for a few seconds before Naomasa broke it with the words, What the hell? Izuku jerked his gaze back upwards. Normally, the reaction was disgust, or if he was lucky, pity, not outright confusion. The confused man in front of him was looking carefully through the papers he had written on before. He seemed to be searching for something. After finding it, he crossed it out and looked back up at Izuku. You're not lying, he sounded baffled, which confused Izuku even more. Of course he wasn't, why would he? The person questioning him had a lie detector for a quirk, it would be useless to try. Naomasa gathered the papers in his hands before standing up and walking out of the room without a word. Izuku was left alone in the silence, wondering what had changed the tone of the questioning so abruptly. When Naomasa finally came back, he looked tired. Alarmingly tired. Izuku almost felt bad for him, if he weren't currently being held against his will. Naomasa sat down heavily at the table across from Izuku, and looked over at him like he wasn't sure what to think about the whole situation. Are you ready to hear your sentence? Izuku nodded once, preparing for the worst. The full sentence is 20 years in prison, or a fine of yen 635, 255 dash. Izuku's head swam. There's no way he could spend that long in prison, and there's no way he could pay that fine off himself. He was about to start hyperventilating when Naomasa continued his sentence. Or it would be if you had a quirk. Izuku's mind stopped working for a second. You see, the detective continued on, much of your sentence was made under the assumption that you were breaking the law of unauthorized quirk use, or using your quirk without a permit. You can probably see why this accusation has been lifted. Naomasa closed his eyes briefly before continuing on. Your updated sentence is 6 months in a special facility that we will choose, or a fine of yen 109,017 dash. I choose the jail time. Naomasa looked shocked at being interrupted, while Izuku clapped both hands over his mouth after his exclamation. He hadn't meant to say it out loud, but his mouth had evidently not gotten the message. Naomasa continued after a few seconds of awkward silence. That's not really your decision. We have verified that you're a minor, so your legal guardian will make the choice for you. We have contacted Midoriya Inko and she should be here in a few minutes. Izuku felt like a bomb had been dropped in his brain. He hadn't even thought of how his mother would react to this whole mess. He gulped down the tears that he felt start to creep up when he pictured her reaction. What if she was angry? What if she yelled at him? Inko never yelled at anyone, but Izuku wasn't in his right mind at the moment. As Izuku was deep within his nightmare world, Naomasa got up without the boy noticing and exited the room once again. He was gone for a few minutes, before bringing a green-haired woman back in the room behind him. He left the two of them alone after she had entered the room. Inko was the first to break the silence. Izuku, she yelled out, diving towards him. He barely had time to jolt out of his chair before he was being tightly hugged by his mother. He tried to get out, but stopped when he felt her tears leaking through his shirt. Izuku held his mother for a minute before she looked up at him with a smile that made his heart feel like it was being shattered. Why didn't you tell me? Her voice wavered, throat clogged by tears. That was what caused him to break. Izuku felt tears flood down his face until he looked identical to his mother. Instead of answering, he just held her tighter. Their combined sobs were the only noise in the room as mother and son both apologized without words. Izuku and Inko talked to each other for 15 minutes before someone came to escort her out. In the time they talked, Izuku had been trying to convince his mom to let him go through the 6th-month sentence other than pay for it. Although she would deny it, Izuku knew that the hours as a nurse didn't pay well. He had seen his mom come home tired enough to go to sleep straight away too many times to even consider letting her pay the fine. He wasn't sure how, but he convinced her to not pay it. Izuku had a wary feeling that it was because of Naomasa. He had briefly entered the room and talked to her for a minute before leaving. His mom had been quick to agree after that, even though he was feeling more anxious now than before. Once everything had been set up and Inko went back home, Izuku was told to follow an officer with cat head out the door. The man looked at him with something that closely resembled thinly veiled disgust. It was nothing he wasn't used to, however, so it didn't bother him much. As they walked together, the officer, who was wearing a name tag that identified him as Sansa, briefed him on where they were going. He didn't need to collect his things at home as his mom would do that for him, and they were currently driving to the place he would spend his time at. The car drive was short, but that was probably because Izuku wasn't paying attention to his surroundings. He was so caught up in his own thoughts that he didn't even notice when they had started to walk through an area that he thought felt familiar, even though he couldn't place his finger on it. Izuku kept his eyes on the ground as he followed Sansa instead of asking where they were going. He was snapped out of his reverie when Sansa said, "We're here," right next to his head. Trailed his gaze upward, Izuku looked over the large cement building that they had arrived at. It started as a joint building on ground level, then split into two on the upward floors. Sansa didn't let him gawk for long and ushered him inside quickly. For a prison, this sure seemed lavish. They walked until they came in front of a wooden door, which Sansa instructed Izuku to stand in front of until he called him inside. With that, Izuku was left alone in the hallway. The first thing Izuku did once he was alone was think. The chances of escaping seemed okay as he had not seen many cameras so far in the building, but he'd rather not cause any trouble for his mom. He had heard that prisoners on good behavior got out sooner, so his best bet would be to be as good as possible. Izuku spared a single thought to think about all the schoolwork he would miss and shuddered. Curious as to what was taking Sansa so long, Izuku pressed his ear against the door to listen in. It sounded like the man was just explaining who he was, though Izuku wasn't sure who he was explaining it to. There weren't any other noises coming from inside. Antivirus. Izuku startled when he heard his hero name from Sansa. Readying himself for whatever was inside, he pushed the door open with his head held high. Izuku only had time to blink in confusion at the 19 equally confused faces before a familiar voice broke the silence that had cloaked the room. "What the F is he doing here?" Bakugo's exclamation was what snapped the previously frozen room back to reality. As soon as Izuku realized where he was, he frantically turned to Sansa to ask him to put him anywhere else. Please, he'd even go an extra 6 months to be anywhere but here. Unfortunately, he was stopped when Sansa started to talk before him. "The head officer on your case has decided that UA is the best place for you to spend your time. We can't put you in a real prison since you're still a minor, so this was the best option. You're not allowed to leave without permission, or without a person accompanying you. Someone should be coming soon from the station to give you your things." Ending crisply, Sansa waited for Izuku to nod once as confirmation before exiting the room. The click of the door sounded extremely ominous to Izuku as he turned and looked back at the class of 19. He felt oddly similar to a mouse in a room of cats before a scream of rage rang out and suddenly his feet weren't touching the ground. Class 1A had been expecting a lot from the popular Vigilante antivirus, to be honest. They expected an adult, which would be weird if he was supposed to be living with them, or someone in control of their life. Someone with confidence, he'd have to be in order to do what antivirus did. All in all, they had been expecting a hero. They certainly weren't expecting a short, skittish boy their age. Everyone was so shocked by this new development that no one really reacted when Bakugo started yelling. They only moved to do anything when he had crossed the room and grabbed the scared-looking boy by the collar and had started yelling in his face. "Whoa, Bakugo! Kirishima was quick to rush over to the pair and separate Bakugo from the boy. Had Bakugo called him Deku's shirt? Though he didn't look too closely, Kirishima was sure he saw the beginnings of tears in Deku's eyes. Bakugo didn't try to go after the boy again, though he still seethed from where he was standing. Kirishima was curious about what Deku had done to invoke that type of reaction from Bakugo, but decided he'd rather try to disable an active bomb on a time limit than ask Bakugo at the moment. Deku was currently on the floor where Bakugo had dropped him, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else but here at the moment. Understandable, considering the circumstances. Mina, surprisingly, was the one to break the awkward blanket of silence that had coated the room. Well then, she started off, I think some introductions right now would be amazing. I'll go first, you can call me Bud ID. She finished off the sentence with a wink to Deku, whose face was bright red at the moment. He tried to sputter out a few words in response, but Ida's scolding of Mina had already overpowered him. That is not at all school appropriate, the boy bellowed, making choppy gestures to try to emphasize his point. Tell him your real name. Ida then turned towards Deku, who had just seemed to cool his red cheeks, and introduced himself. I am Ida Tenya, and it is a pleasure to meet you. He then offered a handshake to which Deku simply looked up and smiled unsurely at. The awkward pause was interrupted once again by Mina, who then began introducing the rest of their classmates. It was an interesting experience. Mina seemed determined to nickname each of their classmates, while Ida was just as determined to correctly introduce everyone. Memorable nicknames were those given to Momo-God, as Mina had said with a straight face, Kaminari-Pikachu. Mina had smirked before saying the nickname, completely ignoring a sputtering Kaminari, and finally Kirishima. His had taken her a moment, but when Mina finally thought of something, she spent a few seconds desperately trying not to laugh before getting out, hard on. Kirishima had been confused for about 6 seconds, and then had choked on his own spit in realization. The rest of the experience had gone much the same way, though everyone seemed to be having fun, so no one really tried hard to put a stop to it. The worst introduction had been Bakugo's. Izuku had interrupted Mina halfway through her explanation to blurt out, Kakin, and had promptly felt ready to fling himself off a cliff. The noise of him slapping his hands over his mouth was the only sound in the room. It had gotten worse when Kaminari had looked between the two questioningly before seeming to light up. Oh, are you guys dating? Kaminari was lucky that Kirishima was between him and Bakugo at that moment, otherwise he might have not gotten out of the exchange unscathed. Bakugo's screaming and Izuku's blushing face signaled to everyone what the answer was, even though neither of them said anything. By the end of the whole situation, Izuku was sure he resembled a Christmas tree with how his green hair and red face paired together. Now, Mina turned back to him with a glint in her eye, while Izuku once again looked like he wanted to crawl into a hole somewhere else. Why don't you tell us something about you, Deku? And with his nickname, the small comfort that Izuku had found in that moment dissipated. Some small part of him was sad that this had happened again, but a larger part of him wasn't surprised. Izuku geared himself up to smile and say something, as it seemed his silence had confused some of the people present, but was startled out of his actions by a sharp knock on the door. Surprise turned to relief when the same three-eyed guard from the station came in with a duffel bag that seemed like it contained his things. The officer looked around the room briefly before beckoning Izuku to follow her, looking almost as uncomfortable as Izuku was feeling at the moment. He quickly made his way over without a glance behind him, afraid that the looks of disdain that he was used to would make him want to droop and hide like they usually did. Walking with the officer, he felt bad for not knowing her name, was a quiet affair, as it had been the first time. They arrived at his room after they took the elevator up a floor and walked down a few hallways. A small sense of dread wrapped itself around Izuku like a stubborn cat as he noticed how close the others' rooms were to him, but he filed the thought away for another time. His room was plain, more like a hotel room than anything else. He began decorating with the posters his mom had packed in the bag once the officer had left him alone, and soon enough the dull walls had some sparks of life in them. Izuku also prayed for a second to whoever was listening that his mom had packed some decent clothes that he could wear, and breathed out in relief when he looked through the cropped shirts and shorts that sat in the bag. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get him through 6 months. Putting up the posters and putting away his clothes took a lot longer than he thought it would, as the sky was pitch black outside the window. Izuku got dressed quickly in a large shirt with a red M on it before crawling into the generic bed that had been in the room when he first got there. Once he lay there in silence, Izuku stared up at the ceiling and started contemplating the mess that was his life at the moment. His mom was the first thought that crossed his mind. His heart ached when he thought of how she must be doing now. Inko had seemed fine after a few minutes at the station, but Izuku had seen that smile on her face before, and he knew that it just meant she'd go and cry again later once she was alone. He got that smile from her, after all. Izuku's thought process swung from topic to topic in his head as he spent a while introspecting. He came back to his mom quite a few times, and Bakugo showed up frequently as well. Most thoughts had a common theme. They felt like they had been coated in dread. The next 6 months might as well be torture as far as he was concerned. It was late in the night when Izuku finally closed his eyes and forced everything from his head. An empty mind was what he fell asleep with, like he often did. Izuku didn't dream that night. Then again, he rarely did nowadays. When Izuku woke up in the morning, he nearly fell out of bed. For a second, he'd forgotten where he was. The new room had shocked him so much that when he jolted upwards, it almost caused him to fling himself off the bed. Everything rushed back to him in a second, though, which changed his previous panic to a cold, stone-like feeling deep inside him that he couldn't place a name on. After getting dressed in the uniform that was left outside his door, Izuku made his way down towards where he remembered the kitchen was. He'd gotten a map from the guard that he'd been quick to memorize, so it was easy to find the room. The building was eerily silent as he walked. "Hey there, Dash!" Izuku screeched when Kaminari came up behind him. He also almost fell over, but that wasn't the point. "Whoa, sorry dude." Kaminari apologized. He actually looked sorry too, so Izuku forgave him quickly. Instead of saying anything, Izuku smiled slightly at Kaminari to show him that no feelings were hurt. After a few awkward seconds, the pair moved out the kitchen and over to the main school building. Izuku had been transferred temporarily into the 1A class as he was already staying in their dormitory. What they expected him to do in a class full of quirks was beyond him. On the way to class, Kaminari explained why he was walking with Izuku. "Everyone woke up before you, so we all played rock paper scissors for who'd have to walk with you. I lost, so I have to, no offense or anything." Kaminari stumbled a bit at the end, trying to avoid offending Izuku. Luckily, very few things got to him these days, so all Izuku did was smile at Kaminari to assure him that all was okay. For some reason, Kaminari stared at Izuku's smile for a few seconds before abruptly turning away and clearing his throat. It got a bit awkward as they kept walking, but Izuku wasn't sure how to combat that. Fortunately for both of them, Kaminari started back up the conversation soon enough. "Man, you've really got a cool quirk, huh? It's not a fighting one for sure, but still." Izuku's smile dimmed a bit when Kaminari started talking about his quirk, but he wasn't in the mood to correct him. Might as well make the most of the friendliness while it lasted, right? "I remember when you helped with that big drag bust. Oh, we're here." They had finally arrived outside a door that was, frankly, over 3 times as tall as Izuku. He followed behind Kaminari and made eye contact with a scruffy-looking man that appeared to be the teacher, though he looked like he'd rather sleep for 6 years than ever step foot near a teenager. Once Kaminari had sat down, Izuku was left by himself at the front of the room. The many stares directed at him made him want to curl in on himself, but he forced himself to appear neutral. The teacher, was he just asleep? Introduced himself and Izuku to the class. All Izuku had to do was smile and wave out at everyone as they learned his name. Most looked confused at the information, like they had not expected that to be his name for some reason. Bakugo was, as usual, fuming from his seat. Izuku's heart sank when he noticed how the only spare seat in the room was directly behind Bakugo, but was startled out of his thoughts when someone asked him a question. "Sorry, could you repeat that?" he had to ask as he had not heard the full question. Uraraka perked up at being acknowledged, before asking again. "Could you show us your quirk?" Today really wasn't going to be a good day for Izuku, was it? After the shock had worn off, Izuku had asked someone for their phone instead of outright answering. At first he had quickly looked towards Aizawa, hoping for some form of excuse not to, but was disappointed when he saw that the teacher was already asleep again. In the end, Izuku borrowed the phone of a bird-headed boy, Tokoyami, if he remembered correctly, and set to work trying to do anything that might impress the class. After a few minutes, Izuku handed back the device. He looked out over the class for less than a second before making eye contact with his shoes and mumbling a string of words no one caught. "Could you repeat that?" Yaoyorozu questioned him after he made no move to repeat himself. Izuku looked upwards before saying his words again, but louder and slightly slower. "Check your phones." His voice rang out as everyone got out their phones. The rustling of bags was quickly followed by exclamation of surprise as people looked at their screens. "What the F happened to my background?" As it wouldn't take long, Izuku had switched the backgrounds of several people's phones. Some students, aka Mina, Kaminari, and Siro, were leaning over people's desks, trying to match the backgrounds they had gotten. Once everyone had set their phones back to normal, Izuku found himself floundering under the mountains of praise being bestowed on him for his quirk. He wasn't used to so much attention and was visibly shrinking into himself. Each mention of his quirk made him feel slightly sick to his stomach. Just as he was about to explain how he was quirkless to everyone, Bakugu's enraged voice cut through the din. "He's effing quirkless, assholes. Back off," he grit out, the words punctuated by small explosions from his hands. A cloud of silence hung over the group after Bakugu's outburst. Izuku felt like shrinking into himself more and more as the seconds ticked by, so much so that he didn't notice someone was asking him another question at first. So you taught yourself how to do that?" A hesitant nod. "Wow, that's amazing, man." Kirishima grinned at him, showing off what Izuku thought were pointed teeth. After that, the compliments only seemed to increase. Izuku's face was as red as Kirishima's hair by the time Aizawa had apparently had enough and actually started class. As he made his way to his seat with a small, dazed smile on his face, Izuku found himself thinking that maybe, just maybe, the next 6 months might not be too bad. Before anyone knew it, classes had ended for the week. The second Izuku had a free day, he slept for the most of it. He'd never gotten a lot of sleep at home. The fact that he could be helping people loomed over him in a way that scared sleep back to whatever hole it had crawled from. When Izuku finally woke up, it was hot. He'd thrown the covers off in his sleep, and for good reason. Izuku felt like he was melting. Quickly changing into one of the shirts his mom packed, thank God she'd recognized what he usually wore, and a pair of jean shorts, Izuku trekked downstairs. The cool air of the kitchen washed over him like a wave, and he found himself smiling as he looked through the fridge. Izuku was 80% certain he wasn't allowed to do what he was currently doing, but he was also 100% certain he'd rather face more jail time than sit in this heat. Grinning once he found what he was looking for, Izuku made his way out to what he guessed was the living room area. It was warmer than the kitchen, but Izuku had his popsicle now and wasn't going to sit on the floor because a room was colder. The room was suspiciously empty, as was the rest of the building. He doubted that they'd willingly leave him by himself, but maybe they'd forgotten him? The thought made him feel a little sad, but he brushed it away when he relaxed into the couch. It was fine. Izuku was startled out of his thoughts when he heard a large slammed door followed by laughing voices. Looking around quickly, Izuku considered bolting for the kitchen, but realized it would be pointless. He stayed where he was, watching the doorway for any signs of life. A few seconds later, it seemed like he was safe. It wasn't that he didn't want to talk to his classmates, he was merely still apprehensive of being in a group with so many people at once. Sighing in relief, Izuku closed his eyes and leaned back with his popsicle in his mouth. He wasn't sure what flavor it was, but it was cold, so it didn't really matter. He was so relaxed, Izuku didn't realize that anyone had entered the room until he heard a voice breathe out, "Holy shit." Izuku jolted back upright in surprise, and immediately felt embarrassed. What if he wasn't supposed to leave his room? What if he wasn't supposed to go through the fridge? What if he had taken someone else's food? Shut the F up, Bakugu growled from the back of the group that still stood in the doorway. Izuku clamped a hand over his mouth. The entire class heard him mumbling, what if they thought he was creepy, Oh no? Bakugu cut over his thoughts again. Effengi, shut up, demon it. Izuku squeaked and looked at the ground, not trying to hide his embarrassment at all. After a few seconds of Bakugu scoffing, he risked a glance upwards. And promptly regretted it. 19 pairs of eyes, Bakugu included, were staring at him. He couldn't place the look in them, though Bakugu certainly looked angry. At what? He couldn't tell. Maybe him? The silence broke when Bakugu spoke up again. Since when did he talk so much to Izuku without a punch behind the words? What the hell are you wearing? Now that was a question Izuku wasn't expecting. Looking down in confusion, Izuku made eye contact with Bakugu before letting out a "huh" noise. The top he was wearing wasn't outright ugly, so what Bakugu talking about? Although he might not look it, Izuku did have a sense of style. It had started when the eyeliner he usually used as part of his mask had gotten runny and smudged after only an hour or two. What had meant to be a quick search for a cheap but long-lasting alternative had led Izuku to a community called Beauty Bloggers, and by proxy, Izuku had knowledge of all the current trends that he wouldn't have noticed previously. That was why he'd thought the crop top that he'd chosen had been fine. Apparently, it wasn't. Izuku flinched when Bakugu caused a small explosion instead of answering his silent question. Everyone else looked at him with something akin to shock on their faces. It wasn't quite that, but it was close enough. After a few seconds of silence, Mina snapped her fingers and turned towards the group as a whole with a wide grin on her face. Shopping trip. She elaborated after all she got were blank stares. We need to do something. Like a shopping trip. She turned towards Ida. Don't you need to buy more glasses? After blinking once to hide his confusion, Ida nodded vigorously and began instructing the class on what to do next. He seemed overly enthusiastic, but Izuku wasn't going to question it. Ida seemed nice, if a bit passionate. After they had worked out where they were going, the class turned towards Izuku again. Most had large smiles, with the exception in a scowl, directed towards him as they asked him if he wanted to go. Izuku accepted easily. Though the clothes his mom had packed were fine, there was only so much you could fit into a duffel bag on short notice. The extra clothes wouldn't hurt. It was a quick trip to the nearest mall. When they got there, everyone split up quickly. Uraraka and Todoroki had gone straight to the nearest food place. Izuku was pretty sure the other girl had dragged Todoroki with her, but as he didn't look too bothered by it, Izuku left them. Mina, Hagakure, Kaminari, and Kirishima had taken him with them to a store he hadn't been to before. As much as he would have liked to buy something from the store they'd picked, the first price tag he laid eyes on turned off whatever desire he'd previously felt. The others weren't deterred, however, and soon heaped piles of clothes into his arms before he had realized what had happened. Can you try these on for us? Mina and Hagakure had grinned at him when they asked. Izuku assumed that was what Hagakure was doing, in such a way that Izuku could only smile shyly at them as he walked over to changing rooms. Kaminari and Kirishima hadn't said much to him yet, but hadn't hesitated to add a ripped shirt. It'll look cool, I swear. And a leather jacket? So manly. It's really not dash. To the pile. Izuku turned away from the mirror as he changed. He didn't want to see the mark on his chest, even if he was used to it. His reveal was more dramatic than it had a right to be honest. Izuku had crept out from behind the curtains slowly and unsure. The four people had looked at him in silence almost hungrily before everyone rushed around at once. Kaminari was saying something about jeans, and Izuku didn't even try to decipher what Hagakure was shrieking about. Everyone seemed happy. Izuku deemed it eventful, even if a little awkward when Kirishima had poked his head in the room after Izuku had taken longer than they thought he would. You okay in their dash? He'd been cut off mid-sentence by a squawk from Izuku. Kirishima immediately started to apologize, but paused when he saw Izuku's chest. What's that? Izuku froze. Kirishima must have seen the scar. What was he supposed to say? No, no, no. Izuku's breaths came out quickly, and his eyes weren't seeing anymore. He'd tugged the shirt he was about to put on to cover the scar subconsciously as he curled inwards. The lights were too bright, and his head felt too heavy for his neck. All he could think of was when, until suddenly there was a hand on his shoulder. Enthusiastic, but Izuku wasn't going to question it. Ida seemed nice, if a bit. Midoriya? Kirishima asked concernedly. The genuine worry in his eyes almost made Izuku want to cry. However, as everyone would question his sanity, more than they already had, anyways, if he burst out in tears, Izuku smiled shakily at Kirishima in an effort to assure him that he's fine. Kirishima didn't look convinced, but exited the room nevertheless. The group left the store pretty soon after that. Although the others didn't know the reason why the overall mood had dropped, they sensed it well enough. Mina was trying to cheer the group up, and it worked after a while. By the time the group had rejoined the other students, everyone was smiling and joking again, even if Izuku still did it shyly. Kirishima did keep an eye on him for the rest of the trip, but mostly relaxed after an hour. Still, the boy kept glancing towards Izuku every once in a while. Not that Izuku minded. It was kind of sweet if he was being honest. After grouping up, the excursion passed without further incident. If anyone noticed Izuku pulling the jacket he'd grabbed before leaving the dorms a little tighter than necessary, they didn't comment on it. As he was leaving the mall with everyone else, Izuku stopped walking when he heard a faint cry. Glancing over his shoulder, his eyebrows furrowed slightly when he took in the scene. A little boy was crying because his mom couldn't buy him the snack he'd grabbed from a shelf. The mother looked close to breaking down like the boy in front of her, and her eyes darted around the crowd before they finally made eye contact with Izuku. Suddenly, Izuku was struck with a feeling of familiarity, almost. It took him a second to place, but soon it hit him. He'd seen the very same look on his own mother, after all, on the days where money was just a bit too tight. Before he'd even realized he was moving, Izuku had started walking towards the mother and son. He bypassed the shocked mom and gently made to grab the snack from the boy. The child looked at him with wide eyes before letting go, and the three of them were silent as Izuku paid for the food. It was lucky that he had enough money left. He hadn't brought much in the first place. Izuku speed walked back towards the group after the transaction was complete. He didn't stop to look at the two people who were gaping at his back, and avoided the gaze of the only person other than Kirishima who had noticed the whole scene. Todoroki, if he remembered correctly, was looking at him with something in his eyes. Izuku couldn't match a word to it in his mind, so he kept his gaze to the floor. He was so caught up with avoiding Todoroki's eyes, Izuku didn't notice the hooded figure watching him from a distance. Izuku had many regrets in his life. The current one at the top of the list was being born quirkless, but trusting Mina, Kaminari, and Shiro ever, in any way, was a close contender at the moment. It had started innocently enough. "We should have a movie night." Kaminari had shouted excitedly once nearly everyone was gathered in the living room area. Mina had quickly backed him up, and after a little prodding, Shiro had joined in as well. Not sure if he was allowed to say no, Izuku just smiled painfully when the group turned towards him with predatory smiles. It couldn't be too bad, right? It was just a movie after all. But, of course, because the universe just loved him, everyone had picked a horror movie. Izuku knew he was done for when over half the group's hands went up at once. Bakugo was looking at him, but with what emotion, Izuku couldn't tell. He was too busy trying to figure out if he could jump out the window from where he was currently sitting. The drop wasn't too far, it wasn't nearly as high as he was used to, but that plan was thwarted when Uraraka snagged his arm in a grip stronger than she looked capable of. Trapped, Izuku was pulled over to a cushion laid out on the floor. While he'd been offered the couch at first, Izuku had declined. He didn't want that many people touching him at a time, or ever, for that matter. The cushion sunk downwards once when Izuku sat down, and then again when someone else joined him. Izuku didn't notice who they were, as the movie had already started, and this was all an incredible mistake. After the cursed film had finally stopped, Izuku was shaking like a leaf in the wind. The only upside to the movie was that when he'd accidentally leaned towards his seat partner, Tokoyami, he'd been awkwardly comforted instead of outright rejected. Still, Izuku absolutely did not let out a soft sigh of content when he first felt dark shadow wrap around his other side, and he would deny it for a long time. Izuku had another reason to thank Tokoyami, too. Along with being a one-man support system, the other boy, who had only flinched a total of 3 times during the whole film, if Izuku remembered correctly, had been the only person to ask to not watch another scary movie. Izuku had been full of so much relief when Tokoyami spoke up that he had involuntarily sighed out loud. If Tokoyami had noticed when Izuku tried to hide behind him when the room's gaze switched to him, he didn't say anything. Well, if we can't watch a movie, Izuku briefly felt bad, then why don't we play Never Have I Ever? And now he didn't. Izuku had a lot of secrets, that was obvious, and the majority of them weren't something he wished to reveal through a party game. The universe had other plans, of course. A group of classmates had left after the movie, stating that they had other things to do. That left only a little over 10 people to play the game: Izuku himself, Bakugo, Uraraka, Ida, Tsu, Kirishima, Kaminari, Mina, Shiro, Yaoyorozu, Jiraiya, and Shinso. After everyone had shifted to make a circle, Kirishima spoke up. Never have I ever gotten drunk. There were a few laughs as one or two people put a finger down. Izuku internally sighed again. As long as the rest of the questions were this easy, he should be perfectly. Never have I ever fell off a building? Fine. First of all, that felt way too specific. Jiraiya had looked bored when she said it though, so it was probably an accident. Probably. Uraraka was the first to point out the absurdity of the question. Really, Jiraiya? She giggled. I don't think anyone just falls off a building. Others joined in her laughter, and they continued to do so until Bakugo's voice rose above them. When the F, did you fall off a diamond building? The laughter died out as everyone looked at Bakugo and then tracked his gaze to Izuku. Izuku shrunk inwards as the group beheld the hand that held up 4 fingers instead of 5. Izuku tried. It was, an accident? He started off strong, but by the end of the sentence, his words had become more of a steady mumble than an actual language. Everyone stared at Izuku in that moment, although he was too busy making eye contact with his curled-up knees to notice. Silence settled as everyone thought to themselves, in some form, an accident? Tsu, apparently deciding to get on with the game, something Izuku was thankful for, asked the next question, and the rest of the game passed quickly after that. Surprisingly, or maybe not, Izuku was one of the first people to put down all his fingers. It's just even more suspicious that you won't tell us why or how you've seen Tentacle Pawn, Shinso drawled in a monotonous voice. Izuku answered by whimpering and burying his head in his hands. Somewhere near the middle of the game, Izuku had begun to loosen up around the group. When he had first let out a small chuckle at the antics of Ida and Uraraka arguing, "Have you never turned in a late homework assignment? It is simply bad time management and perfectly easy to avoid." Everyone had stared at him briefly before joining in. The jovial tone and feeling of the whole game felt like a thick blanket king rested on his shoulders. It was the most fun he'd had in a long time, even if some things were better left unknown. Note for the future: do not hack into any photos belonging to someone with a tentacle quirk. Just don't. Izuku learned some things about his new classmates as well. At least 2 people had outed themselves in the game when the question, "Never have I ever liked a girl?" was asked, and Izuku surprisingly wasn't the only person to have had more than one near-death experience. He wanted to ask, but also didn't. He wasn't the only person in the circle to have read a reader insert fanfiction about a pro hero before. Bakugo had stared directly at Izuku when he asked the question, and you couldn't have paid Izuku up front in that moment to look back, but he was the only person to have one at a claw game. Wow. Those things are rigged. Kaminari sputtered, looking around the group for backup. Izuku leaned forwards a little as he reached up and scratched his head sheepishly. He tried a smile, a nervous giggle falling from his lips. "I'm just lucky, I guess." In that aspect, at least. The rest of his life was basically the chaos theory in action. Although he couldn't see it, across the circle, Kaminari elbowed Shiro discreetly and jerked his head towards the smiling Izuku with a smirk on his face. Shiro shoved him back before he turned back to the circle. After the game ended, the remaining players dragged out more cushions. At this point, Izuku had stopped counting them, but he was positive that the number was over 16, and set them up in a sloppy attempt of a pillow fort. Izuku nearly fell over laughing when Bakugo had started yelling again and Uraraka had thrown a pillow at his head. The whole experience was completed when Yaoyorozu, she'd said to call her Momo, if he remembered right, produced 5 whole blankets half the size of the room bashfully. Izuku had to physically cover his own mouth to keep from asking her questions about her quirk in that moment. Wouldn't want to ruin the mood with his own weird habits. While making the fort was easy, the hardest part of the evening was trying to figure out where everyone should sleep. Sleeping on the ground could potentially damage our spines. Ida was arguing, jerking his hands to accentuate his point. We need to. Kaminari retorted with the same amount of vigor. The two argued for a bit before finally Ida yielded. The point might have been helped by Izuku making a form of his puppy eyes as his mom called them at Ida, but that was besides the point. Soon after Ida relented, the remaining classmates formed small piles in and around the pillow fort. Bakugo had been complaining loudly before Kirishima took one for the team and grabbed him tightly as he dragged the raging blonde to the ground. Bakugo started to scream but stuffed a sock in it when the group collectively shushed him. His glare did burn stronger than ever. After the Bakugo situation was sorted out, Izuku stood off to the side as people found their friends. Jairu had been the first to claim a corner with a sigh. She dragged Momo down with her, who seemed slightly red in the face. Maybe it was from the use of her quirk? Izuku could feel the questions still rolling around in his mind. The pair intertwined their legs as they got comfy, and Izuku suddenly felt like this was something a little too private for him to be seeing. Averting his eyes, Izuku looked across the room at the small pile of bodies near Kirishima and Bakugo. Kaminari was resting his head on Mina's stomach, and the both of them had at least one limb thrown across Zero. Zero had an extra pillow so that he could sleep on his elbows comfortably and looked okay with the whole arrangement. Kirishima was the only person brave enough to not really but kind of cuddle with Bakugo, though it was probably for the best. Izuku looked to the middle of the room. Ida was so straight-backed as he slept, it almost looked painful. Uraraka and Tsuyu were practically spooning, with Uraraka hugging Tsuyu loosely from behind. She didn't leave Ida out of the embrace and rested snuggled into his side, though Ida didn't seem affected. Izuku felt out of place in the face of such familiarity. Fortunately, or unfortunately, he didn't seem to be the only one. Shinso was by himself tucked under a small cave-like structure made out of some spare cushions. Although he looked comfortable, he also looked a bit lonely next to the rest of the class. Maybe if he asked nicely, he could sleep near him? But what if Shinso said no? He might come off as creepy too, which would be awful, and then he'd make another enemy already, and he really didn't need that. Come on, Shinso mumbled, like he hadn't really bothered to open his mouth all the way. I won't bite, you know. Izuku barely managed to clamp down on his panicked yelp. He'd probably started muttering again. Shinso must think he's so weird. Except, didn't he just invite him over? Izuku stared at Shinso, but the other boy didn't return his gaze. His eyes had already slipped shut again. Izuku was kind of glad. He looked like he hadn't slept in half a century. Warily making his way over, Izuku crawled up to Shinso before slowly lowering himself to the ground. Faintly, Izuku could make out Shinso snoring softly, almost like a cat purr. Before he knew it, Izuku's own eyes were closing as he, too, fell into a dreamless sleep. Toshinori walked to the dorms with curiosity and a tinge of worry on his mind. Half the class hadn't shown up to homeroom, according to Aizawa, and the half that did had just giggled when asked where their classmates were. Aizawa had sighed in response before calling up Toshinori, so here he was now. The dorms were silent as Toshinori unlocked them. Peeking through the door to the common room, the hero paused in astonishment. A fond smile spread across his face as he took in the view of all the children. At least he didn't have to worry about the newest addition either, as evidenced by the boy curled up in a tangle of limbs with the other semi-new student of 1A. The pair almost looked similar to two cats if you squinted. Toshinori backed out of the doorway as quietly as he could. It might be best to let the kids sleep for a little while longer. Aizawa's annoyed face at him that would surely be a result of Toshinori telling him what happened flashed through his mind. Toshinori shivered once before deciding that not only would the children get in trouble, he would too if he let them sleep. It had nothing to do with his fear towards the black-haired menace that was an annoyed Aizawa. Nothing at all. Changing to his other form, All Might smiled as broadly as he could as his voice boomed through the previously silent building. Good morning. School passed quickly once Izuku got comfortable with the rest of the class. Before he realized it, Izuku had already served around a month of his sentence. 5 more months, and everything would go back to normal. He'd be free. It was hard to think about that though, when every other day something strange seems to happen in the dorms. Group sleepovers became a thing with the class. Shinso slowly got more comfortable with everyone as well as Izuku, and though he rarely full-on laughed, a smug smirk was commonplace on his face. He had a lot to smirk about after all. Izuku wasn't 100% sure that Class 1A was sane. Kaminari had a tendency to take other people's food for starters. Not many people got annoyed, with the exception of Bakugu. Kaminari had only stole his food once, though, and promptly regretted it as the curry sizzled in his mouth. He'd almost tried the same thing with Izuku, but the other boy had just offered the food with a smile instead. Kaminari's previously grateful look transformed into a horrified one quicker than Izuku could trip over his own feet, and no one touched his food again. Sure, he liked spicy food as much as Kakin, but it wasn't that strong, right? Yeah, Kaminari had wheezed from his spot on the floor. Really is? So that was a thing that happened. Mina and Hagakure were the masterminds behind, how mad can we make Ida before he busts an artery? And it was a wild ride. Bakugu was the current winner of the game, and he wasn't even technically playing. Izuku, surprisingly, was a close second. It might have had something to do with the fact that most of Bakugu's property damage was a result of him, but that was irrelevant. Tokoyami took up a solid 3rd place when he ate noodles with scissors once, and still feels smug about it, though he won't often bring it up. Kuda had a small animal rescue center in his room that Izuku helped maintain every Wednesday. Uraraka could bench press him, with and without her quirk. Sometimes Sato would give Izuku an extra lick or two of the batter when they made cookies together. Jiraiya played music too loudly at 3 a.m. on the weekends. Shinso could be found, not unlike a cryptid, sleeping on random surfaces, including but not limited to the coffee table, doorways, and on one occasion, the top of the fridge. Everyone in 1A was, for lack of better word, quirky. Izuku didn't spend too much time dwelling on what that made him. Clothing mix-ups happened fairly frequently too. They happened at such a rate that Izuku was getting a little suspicious, actually. It can't be a coincidence to have someone's shirt 6 times in a week, Hagakure, you can just ask. And oh god, the gossip. He got enough of that from accidentally going through Hiro's phones, but no one else seemed to think so. There was a betting pool for when Momo and Jiraiya would finally start dating going on that Izuku absolutely did not want a part of, but maybe put him down for a month from now too. All in all, the transition was going great. No one mentions the great monopoly crisis, but Izuku still won, no matter what you say, Bakugu. A downside upside? He wasn't sure of the close quarters was that Izuku had attracted his own mother hen of sorts. Kirishima, while not always obvious about it, worried a bit more over him than others. He never asked about the scar, no matter how much he appeared to, and didn't treat Izuku like glass either, so he didn't mind. It was greatly appreciated when he moved himself to partially cover up Izuku as everyone changed into their respective costumes, though. Now that he thought about, Kirishima's hovering had done more good than bad. Once everyone had gathered in front of a large gate, that's where we had the entrance exams. Uraraka had pointed out, jumping up and down a little bit. It would have been much cuter if not for the practically devilish look on her face. All Might appeared with Aizawa standing beside him. Aizawa sighed once before speaking, seeing how All Might clearly wasn't going to break the ice. Today, we'll be doing a rescue exercise. It's pretty unorthodox, so don't get cocky. He looked towards Izuku before adding a tilt of his head in the same direction. You'll be rescuing him. The exercise was explained quickly after the brief shock had passed. It was fairly straightforward. Find Izuku, bring him back to the front of the gates. First person to do so didn't have to do the essay due in English. Then again, this was you. Nothing was straightforward. The 2 teachers had pulled him aside the day before in order to discuss the day's exercise. The meeting was brief, but still at the forefront of Izuku's mind as he looked around at the excited faces of his classmates. Tomorrow, the class will be doing a training exercise focusing on rescuing you, Aizawa had said in a bored voice. All Might was mostly watching from the side, not want to interrupt the other man. He coughed and turned to Izuku once Aizawa sent a pointed look towards him. "We would greatly appreciate it if you did your best to avoid being rescued." All Might boomed before sputtering blood as he switched forms. It wasn't a surprise as much as concerning. Everyone had seen his form already after the fight with a powerful villain. Seeing that All Might wasn't going to continue, Aizawa sighed again. He seemed to do that a lot, before starting where he left off. "The rest of the class will be trying to catch you, and it'd be much more informational if they actually had to sweat while doing it," Aizawa said in bored tone. "You've avoided us this long, let's see how they stack up." All Might chose that moment to jump back in. "You won't be going in empty-handed, of course. We've both decided to let you take one item to aid you, so no need to worry." He tried a smile at the end of it, though it looked a little painful. Izuku, meanwhile, was feeling an emotion he hadn't felt since he came to UA. It hurt to be underestimated, he would know. Something in people's smiles always changed when learning he was quirkless. It was like the person went from looking at him to a baby. It stung in a way that few people understood when he tried to explain it. Maybe the years of doing more of a difference than most people his age had affected him, but Izuku felt a little insulted. Just a bit. Pro heroes hadn't been able to catch him until recently, and he'd been at the same gig for almost 2 years. No matter the extent of the class's quirks, and they truly were impressive, the situation made him feel strange. Izuku was used to strange, everyone was in a world of quirks, but this was different. He didn't realize it then, but that was exactly the teacher's plan. After ending the meeting, Izuku walked away with the strange feeling curling in his stomach. He didn't hear the two heroes talking as he walked away. It might have weakened whatever emotion he was currently feeling. "Who do you think will catch him first?" All Might asked Aizawa, tilting his head slightly. The man responded with a slow, toothy smile and a low drawl. "Who said they would?" Back in the previous moment, the class was eyeing him with excitement and a bit of smugness at the thought of being the first to rescue him. Izuku just smiled encouragingly in response as he fingered the chrome lighter in his pocket. Hopefully, everyone would learn from this exercise in more ways than one. Izuku had a 2-minute head start. He jogged lightly across the rooftops and made a show of climbing carefully down the ladder on the side of the building. Wouldn't want to give any hints of his abilities right off the bat. Once he was out of sight, Izuku was struck with a sense of familiarity. It was strange, the completely grayscale landscape should have seemed as featureless as possible. So, why did Izuku feel like he'd been here before? It hit him in a way that caused a grin to break out across his face in giddiness. If he was right, then this was going to be much easier than he thought. Izuku walked briskly as he counted the alleyways to his right. Who knew had much more time he had, but he had to confirm his hunch. 3, 4, 5. And there was the same fire escape that he'd fallen off a year ago, the same height from the ground and everything. Looked like Izuku was right. The school had just copied a portion of the city. Izuku didn't have a whole lot of time to dwell on the new development, as All Might's booming voice rang out at the same time he had the realization. "Start!" This was an experience. Siro was chasing him at the moment. He was the first to find Izuku and had lost a few seconds of time trying to stop and chat. His smile had dropped in confusion when Izuku had booked it in the other direction. The expression change made Izuku go from happy to finally have someone to run from to guilty at lying to everyone. It was for the school, though, so it couldn't be too bad, right? That's what he told himself, anyways. It partially worked. "Wait!" Siro yelped, jumping forward to chase after Izuku. And what a chase it was. Izuku hadn't been tailed this closely for at least a month. Sometimes his reputation helped out in the long run. Most pro heroes didn't try half as hard as Siro was at the moment. His hand shot out to grab the telephone pole as Izuku redirected his path. A sharp turn here, a vaulted fence there, and even a wall jump or two wasn't enough to shake off Siro. Izuku was getting a bit frantic. Frantic made him more reckless and careless. And he was about to pay for it. It was a small slip-up. A miscalculation, and all of a sudden Izuku was crashing through a window. Siro made a noise of distress as he saw Izuku disappear into the building, but Izuku barely processed it. The flying glass had been mostly deflected by his gloves, and he'd felt much worse pain before. He more preoccupied by the fact that he could go inside the buildings. This changed a lot of his plans. It was easy to duck in a building if he needed to, and it was a quick way to confuse whoever was following him, too. The interior was a gamble, but it was still a good advantage. Izuku got up quickly and started sprinting again. He wasn't too phased yet, but his breathing was a bit labored. He'd be fine for a while longer. Once Shiro saw he was up and running, he shot out a single strand of tape. Izuku made a mental note to add to his notebook on the class. Shiro couldn't run the tape strands forever, and they seemed to decrease over time. The tape still got caught on the back of his hoodie as he turned a corner and finally made it to the ground floor by flying down the stairs. He'd detach it later. Izuku ran, and ran until he couldn't hear Shiro's shouts behind him. Feet pounded against pavement and walls and windows and wherever Izuku needed to be. Something inside him curled and pulled in what should have been unpleasant but wasn't, and he was sure his feet were numb, but he just kept going and Izuku slowed, then stopped altogether. There was a voice in the back of his head, telling him to run, more, get out of here. But this was nothing like that. For one, he was safe here, despite the close call before, and two, Mina was quickly gaining on him. He scrambled up a convenient ladder before running again, if a little slower than before. Yeah, this was nothing like that. The next person he encountered was Kaminari. It was a close call. Izuku was counting down the moments when his luck would finally run out at this point. The only warning he got was a telltale crackle noise before Izuku jumped up to grab the roof of the building. As he looked down, he saw electricity bouncing along the metal fire escape he'd been standing on the minute prior. If he hadn't moved, Midoriya. Izuku glanced as far as he could over the edge of the fire escape. Kaminari was grinning up at him, and even waved with his free hand. "Ah, I was so close," he pouted, but smiled again after a second. "Shiro says that you ran away from him? You didn't have to save yourself for me, you know." He finished off the dramatic declaration with a swoon. As Kaminari talked, Izuku was calculating the probability of him breaking his neck if he jumped from this height. Normally, it'd be pretty low, but with the angle he was at, well, distantly, right before he jumped, Izuku remembered a joke Kaminari had made the day before. Right before jumping off the couch in the common room, it was a long story, and falling flat on his face, he'd shouted a word. If he remembered right, a startled smile made its way onto Kaminari's face as Izuku shouted, "Parkour," as loud as he dared. It was replaced by a panicked look as Izuku pushed off the wall as hard as he could and performed a messy twist midair. His fingertips barely grabbed the windowsill on the opposite wall, but he used the lighter he'd brought to break that window to get inside. Kaminari was squawking outside, but Izuku just grinned as he ran away from yet another of his classmates. For maybe 15 minutes after those incidents, not a lot stuck out to Izuku. Most of his other classmates didn't have mobility-based quirks, and those that did hadn't found him for a while now. Todoroki had briefly been terrifying, but he couldn't go into the buildings as quickly as Izuku. Still, Izuku let out a groan as he peeked out the window and barely dodged an eye full of ice. That didn't make him any less powerful. It would make much more sense for the other boy to set the building on fire and lure him out. All Might and Aizawa hadn't said to avoid damage to the surrounding buildings after all, but Todoroki seemed to have a preference for his ice side. It was more an outright refusal to use his fire side, but Izuku wasn't blaming him too much. He knew what his home life was like. It wasn't always an advantage to know everything about everyone. That was a while ago though, and at the moment, Izuku was just catching his breath. He had a steady mumble going about his classmates and their quirks. It was quiet enough that Izuku didn't notice the shadow lunging for him until it was almost on him. The somersault he did to get out of the way was the exact opposite of elegant, and the fact that he had rolled right off the roof only accentuated this. "Ichihai Tokoyami." Izuku spoke from where he dangled off the side of a window. "Hello, Midoriya." Izuku barely had time to fling himself through the window as dark shadow dove for him. His shoulder hurt from the force it had taken to break the glass, but it bought him a second of time. Izuku's mind moved as fast as his feet as he ran through the rooms. What to do? Dark Shadow had a weakness for light. He had a lighter. That was something, right? Izuku ducked into a room off to his right as he formed a plan. It was as barren as the rest of the other rooms, so there was nothing to hide behind. Think. An idea hit him. Izuku wrenched off his left glove and pulled the tape that was still attached to him off his back. He combined the two and got the lighter ready as he waited. Just a second or two. The door opened with a bang. Izuku lit the glove on fire and slapped it onto Dark Shadow as quickly and as fast as he could that his hands stung a bit. Dark Shadow recoiled, and Izuku had enough time to jump back out the doorway and keep running. His breathing was heavy and quick as he vaulted through another window and onto the rooftop right outside it. Maybe they shouldn't have been so quick to underestimate Izuku, but he definitely shouldn't have underestimated the aspiring heroes, either. Izuku might have a fear of frogs after this. Tsuyu was in her element among the cement buildings, and it showed. Everywhere he looked, she was clinging to a wall or perched on top of a building. It was downright terrifying. Izuku barely managed to dodge Tsuyu's tongue again as he dropped to his knees. He needed another plan quickly. If he made a left here and then jogged a bit, he should get to the edge of that roof. The jump was too big for him to make, he tried, but Tsuyu hopefully didn't know that. It was the best thing he could come up with. He felt Tsuyu at his back as he sprinted. A few more steps. Izuku whirled around and threw himself forward as hard as he could. Tsuyu hadn't been expecting this, as far as Izuku could tell. People say that in a panic, things seem to slow down, but it was all Izuku could do to keep up with the moment. He rolled to avoid her and then kept sprinting until he could go feet first through the third-story window in the building across from them. Izuku lost Tsuyu quickly after that. His breath rang in his ears as he kept running, and adrenaline was sickly sweet as it coursed through his veins. If adrenaline was electricity in that moment, Izuku would have glowed. It was a mistake to forget about Bakugo. It was a mistake to forget about Bakugo. It was a mistake. Get back here, V. A very big mistake. Bakugo was quick and agile, so confusing him in the maze of alleyways wasn't an option. He was, however, loud, so Izuku at least had a warning when he was close. Not that it helped much. "Du." Bakugo barked, switching directions midair to squeeze between the two houses Izuku had ran through. Yep, really didn't help. It was a miracle that no one had some to see what the racket was about. How big was the faux city anyways? Izuku was dreading the moment he'd have more than one person on him at a time. What were Bakugo's weaknesses again? He couldn't think of anything specific, but he just had to get out of sight. Yeah, that'd work. A parking lot was coming up if he remembered correctly. If he was lucky, there would be cars in it. If not, then he was done for. He'd been fairly lucky this whole time. Might as well chance it. Izuku sped up when he saw some clumps of cement that were clearly trying to imitate cars in the parking lot. He dodged them and crouched down behind one of the larger ones. Now he was out of sight, and could maybe rest a bit. Except now he couldn't see Bakugo. Izuku almost groaned out loud, but stayed quiet so as to not alert his chaser of his whereabouts. His own ears were ringing from Bakugo's explosions, so it was useless to try and pinpoint him busy the sound of his breathing. Izuku got out his lighter to have something to fiddle with as he thought. He could risk peeking his head around, but that could always backfire. Izuku looked back at his reflection in the chrome lighter and promptly felt like an idiot. Angling the lighter so that he could see around the car, Izuku watched as Bakugo looked around the surrounding area. He clenched and unclenched his fists in barely contained anger, and his gaze was sharp. He didn't seem to be moving around much, though. Maybe Bakugo would give up and walk away, and Izuku would be safe to flee. Or he could use his explosions to propel himself into the air to overlook the lot. That was fine too. He had maybe 3 seconds to do something. He didn't need his other glove, right? He lit the remaining glove on fire and barely bit down on the whimper that threatened to leave him what the flames liked over his pinky. That would hurt later, as would the rest of the burns he currently had. Maybe a lighter wasn't the best idea. No time to dwell on it now, though. Any moment now, Bakugo would catch sight of his green hoodie. Honestly, now that he thought about it, he should change it to something less conspicuous, like black. Before Bakugo got too high up, Izuku threw the flaming glove as far to his right as he could. Please let him fall for it. Please let him fall for it. The gods favored him in that moment, as Bakugo immediately shot towards the flaming glove. Milking the opportunity for all it's worth, Izuku ran through the cars and beyond until Bakugu's scream of rage at being tricked no longer rang in his ears. He was going to need a nap after this. Scratch that, he was going to need a long nap after this. Maybe 3 or 4 hours. Or better yet, just sleep for the rest of the day. Yeah, that sounded nice. It turned out that while the school didn't have the time to use actual cars, they did apparently have enough to string cables across several poles and buildings. They weren't as slender as actual telephone lines, so it was simple enough to run along them. Which led to Izuku's current predicament. Kirishima was too heavy in his hardened form to run across the cables as quickly as Izuku, so he waited at the other side sadly. He seemed to be waiting for Izuku to fall, which Izuku wouldn't, of course, unless Bakugu happened to show up and make a grab for him. There you are, UF dash. This was fine. Izuku stopped his run across the cables to stare numbly at Bakugu's gaining form. He couldn't go back or he'd run into Kirishima, and he couldn't go forward in time to escape Bakugu. What was he supposed to do? To make things worse, Tsuyu had reappeared at Bakugu's shouts as well. She watched from the roof of a one-story building below everyone else. Jumping down would just deliver him straight to her, and the jump would surely break a bone or two. Just as Izuku came to the conclusion that he was supremely effed, as Bakugu would say, his foot slipped out from under him. Dimly, Izuku felt the cable recoil as his weight lifted from it. Bakugu's face was twisted but gone too quickly for Izuku to read into it, and Kirishima was shouting something that he couldn't make out. All that he could think of was falling, until he wasn't. Izuku looked down at where Tsuyu had shot her tongue out to catch him. Distantly, he made note of how she seemed to have control over how hard she gripped him, but switched his train of thought when he realized that this was the moment where he'd lose. His mind wasn't running on coherent sentences at this point. It was more a jumble of words that barely made sense. Tonga muscular burn fire. Without giving himself time to think, Izuku took his lighter and dragged the open flame in one smooth motion across his chest. Really? Recovery girl huffed. Was setting yourself on fire the only option? Izuku nervously laughed and made to scratch his head before hissing in pain when the burns got agitated again. And no. The old lady sighed and didn't continue the conversation. Shortly after escaping from his 3 classmates, the exercise had ended. Izuku had fidgeted and blustered out apologies to the class after All Might and Aizawa had revealed what they'd told him. The class had grown silent before erupting in exclamations of outrage. At first, Izuku had thought they were at him, but just as he shrunk in on himself, Uraraka had assured him that it wasn't him they were mad at, but the teachers. Apparently they'd pulled a similar trick before, but Izuku wasn't given any details. Mina had muttered, "logical ruse," under her breath with such passion that he was afraid to ask, so it was probably for the best. Back to the present, where Recovery Girl was giving him a scolding that would have made even All Might feel chastised. At least she hadn't mentioned the scar when she forced him to remove the burned clothes. Shortly after Izuku was praised for managing to avoid everyone, someone had tried to give him a hug but stopped at his quick hiss of pain. The pain hadn't been too bad a minute ago, but by the time Izuku had finally been taken to the nurse, tears were barely being held back. Izuku essayed in a quick breath as Recovery Girl cleaned the burns thoroughly before wrapping them several times in bandages. As far as Izuku could tell, he'd burned both of his forearms in places, several of his fingers, and finally across his chest. Most of the burns were accidents with the exception of the last one. At least it had worked, right? It might have worked, but it sure didn't do much for you. Izuku squeaked and brought his hands up to his mouth. He had to put them down when Recovery Girl scolded him for moving, though. His muttering sure hadn't got any better over the years. After getting a kiss and a shortened version of the usual lecture from the nurse, Izuku was sent on his way back to the dorms. The class was waiting for him, and all of a sudden, Izuku was struck with the full force of what having people genuinely care about him felt like. It was a little hard not to, with 19 worried and congratulatory voices pointed at him at once, after all. Izuku looked out the red sky. The sun had risen a minute or two ago, but the sky had stayed the same deep crimson color. Oddly, there weren't any clouds. It was strange, seeing the sky look like someone had simply taken a brush and painted over it. Izuku was snapped out of his thoughts by a tap on his shoulder. Taking his gaze off the window, he listened as well as he could with his morning-muddled brain. So do you have any, stories? About when you saved people? It sounds so fun. Izuku's mind flashed to a few choice incidents. Fun was one way to put it. Do you want to know anything in particular? Uraraka seems to think for a minute before shrugging with a smile on her face. Not really, but everyone else might, she said happily before grabbing Izuku's wrist and dragging him to the circle of people that had gathered in the common room. Izuku didn't have enough time to protest before he was plopped between Uraraka and Kirishima. There weren't a whole lot of people in the circle, at least. Most people were still in their beds before school. Only Uraraka, Ida, Shinso, Tokoyami, and Kirishima were currently up. Maybe telling some stories wouldn't be too bad? Have you ever killed anyone? Uraraka asked excitedly, leaning a little into Izuku's space. Or not? Uraraka laughed when Izuku appeared to think over the question, even though he was just trying to come up with a nice way to say no. Ida's scandalized gasp set her and Kirishima off into giggles, and Tokoyami just kept the stone-cold face he tried to maintain at all times. It was a little offset by the crisscrossed legs held up close to his chin, though. Shinso might have been asleep the whole time. Izuku finally stuttered out a no over his laughing friends he hoped he could call them that, but it wasn't like they would know, and they got back to asking him questions. Most were fairly simple. Anything you've ever regretted? Some did need a bit of explaining. I just don't get how you somehow lost your pants and shirt but not socks, dude. It was all in harmless fun. At one point, the focus went from Izuku to what Izuku really did. You do coding, right? Uraraka asked as she rested her head on her hands in an inquisitive pose. Do you know any codes? Ida cut in before Izuku could reply. Although the name is misleading, Midoriya is proficient in computer coding. Ciphers are a different matter entirely, Uraraka. It is a simple mistake. Ida punctuated each sentence with a sharp gesture, a stern look on his face. Then again, Ida always had a stern look on his face, so it didn't make much of a difference. Izuku coughed in an attempt to dispel the silence that settled over the group. He felt a bit bad for Uraraka's mistake, even though he hadn't had much to do with it. Might as well throw her a bone, right? Izuku stuttered over his words when the group's focus shifted towards him, minus Shinso. He still looked to be asleep, but continued on anyways. I do know a few codes. They're, not that interesting though. Uraraka lit up and maybe gave Ida a smug glance, but Izuku wasn't sure, before prompting him to continue. I think they're really fun. I only really know one with lots of symbols and I need the key for it, but it's still fun, don't you think? Her words drawled as she got more and more excited and comfortable. Izuku remembered a code that had a different symbol for each English letter of the alphabet vaguely, but couldn't recall the name. As long as he could read English fluently, then it was a fairly simple code. My favorite one is the Vigilante square, but it's pretty complicated. Izuku responded to the best of his ability. How could he explain why he knew it to his friends without sounding extremely sad? When I was younger, good so far, keep going, I didn't want to tea-talk. They didn't need to know the reason why, so my mom and I figured out a way to, talk? We passed notes and other stuff. Of course, because Izuku was not only shy, but paranoid to boot, he'd picked one of the most complicated ciphers he could find as a child. Learning the English alphabet took him a long time and made him less adept at what they were supposed to be learning in school, but it ended up working well with the code he'd picked. Plus, being mostly fluent in English at a young age had helped with coding. The conversation leapt from topic to topic after Izuku's admission. It wasn't as focused on him as it had been before, and he was a bit grateful. Talking about his past usually left a slight burning feeling at the back of his throat, almost as if when he tried to swallow his emotions, he'd swallowed down a lick of fire or two along with them. This time was different. Despite the fact that the fire was still there, it flowed through him like hot tea, not burning but warm, accenting his senses so that his body was fully relaxed. To us. Izuku didn't have time to dwell on the feeling as Shinso woke up, so he had been asleep, after all. in the middle of Kirishima's story. He'd looked around dazedly for a second or two before locking eyes with Izuku. "Aizawa and All Might need you after school," he said lowly after both of them had held a brief impromptu staring competition. "Don't know why, just said to tell you." With that, Shinso fell back asleep. Izuku probably would have badgered him for the awkward sleeping position he was in. He might act like a cat, but his spine did not. But at the moment he was too busy having a nervous breakdown. He'd only been doing what the teachers asked him to, but what if he did it wrong? Maybe he was supposed to follow some other rule and he forgot about it? What if they were mad at him for some other reason? What if... Izuku was nudged by Kirishima, who in doing so stopped his oncoming muttering storm. Izuku startled, and then laughed awkwardly amidst an apology or two, which Kirishima quickly assured wasn't necessary. Still, Izuku felt bad for going back into his old habit. He'd been told enough times how creepy it was. The class didn't seem to mind as much, though, so maybe it was okay? Izuku didn't think about it too much, as classes were starting soon. His classmates trickled down the stairs and hallways slowly and groggily. They looked similar to zombies until they each did their morning routines. For some, it was coffee. Others did. There was always a few that differed. Kaminari Essigd on a charger as he moved around, and Sada chewed on sugary gum as he made everyone breakfast, but most started out in the same tired state. Izuku was one of the only morning people in the class. Wake the F up. With the exception of Bakugu. Kirishima hardened himself with a sigh as he moved to protect whoever had invoked Bakugu's wrath this time. Shiro looked accepting of death in that moment as Bakugu yelled at him, and Izuku couldn't quite blame him. Luckily, before anyone actually died via the flaming blonde, Bakugu was moved out of range by Kirishima. It took a whole lot of guts to personally grab Bakugu by the waist and carry him away. Kirishima was a blessing to everyone in 1A. Before Bakugu could explode on him in more ways than one, Kirishima dropped him when he looked at the time. Everyone else rushed to either change, "I didn't even notice you were here," Hagakure, brush their hair, "Why don't you just brush it before you sleep, Midoriya?" "I do, it tangles again." Or complete last-minute homework, "Dude, really? That's been due for 2 weeks." "I live a sad life, Kirishima." It was almost as entertaining as a circus. Izuku, along with the group of people he'd been talking with, was already ready for the day as they waited. Izuku didn't ask why the others were up, and they didn't ask him. He sat content, sipping some of the tea his mom had slipped into the bag she'd packed. The tea reminded him of his mom, but he shook himself before he could go down that road. The thought of her did make the tea a little warmer, even as he scrunched up his nose at the sour taste. He didn't quite get her fixation with orange tea. Once everyone was ready, classes passed like usual for the most part. English was his best subject, so if he dozed off a bit, it wouldn't affect him too much grade-wise. He hadn't thanked Kirishima for nudging him subtly when his head was almost ready to hit the desk, but hopefully his smile had been enough. The only thing that stuck out about the school day was when Izuku was separated from the everyone else during heroics class. All Might looked across the table at Izuku. There was a minute of silence before All Might seemed to remember that he was the one who had brought Izuku into the room, and Izuku had no idea what was going on. All Might stopped to cough up blood. It took a lot for Izuku to not immediately get up and try to help him. "Who do you think did the best in yesterday's exercise?" All Might asked once he'd recovered. Izuku thought for a second. Todoroki had a lot of power, but only used half of it. Tokoyami was quick and quiet, but didn't have the best reflexes. Kaminari didn't have a backup plan. All in all, he'd have to pick. Shiro and Kaken did the best, he said quietly, but got louder as he started his usual rambling. Shiro used the buildings really well, and if I hadn't fallen through the window All Might winced at that, but Izuku didn't notice. I probably wouldn't have, gotten away. Kaken moved quickly and he used his quirk to get an above view, which gave a better view than having to look from the alleyways. He also used it in an area that otherwise wouldn't have worked, as I could have been inside a building if we were in a different area. However, since we were in a flat space without sufficient cover, it would have worked out nicely for Kaken if I hadn't had the lighter or something else reflective All Might watched Izuku a little dazedly. The boy hadn't stopped talking for a while now, And he didn't even seem to breathing. All Might waited for Izuku to stop to take a breath before asking the next question that Aizawa had told him to ask while he had the chance. Do you think anyone could have benefited from working together? If so, who? All Might read from the cards in front of him, provided by Aizawa. It was almost like the other man expected him to fail at something as simple as asking a question. Izuku blinked as he paused, ready to continue his analysis, when his face suddenly reddened as he realized that he'd started his usual psychoanalysis of other people's quirks. He was so busy covering his face with his arms panically that Izuku didn't comprehend the question at first. When he did finally understand the question asked, Izuku sunk right back into analysis mode. All Might could only sigh internally, if a little fondly, for reasons he wasn't sure of, before Izuku was gone from the world once again. Hagakure and Kaken would make a good team because Kaken is much more loud and attention-grabbing than Hagakure, so she could probably easily approach the villain without being spotted with Kaken acting as a good distraction. Kaken would have to be careful to not hit Hagakure, though, which might alert the villain if he's holding back at all. Tokoyami and Tsuyu are both agility-based, so they would seem like a good pair, but they don't cover up each other's weaknesses because they have the same strengths. It depends on the situation, though, because in the city they do well together, but on a flat plane the fight might be more supported by Tokoyami. Uraraka could work best with Kaken, Tsuyu, and maybe Ajiru. Kaken would have to put less power behind his blasts in order to move around, so he'd be able to chase or fight longer than if he had to support his whole weight. But he'd also have to get used to the new amount of power, which might slow him down before he's perfect at it. Tsuyu also wouldn't have to use so much of her strength. Ajiru gets the same advantage as well, but everyone also needs time to get used to a new center of gravity. I'd probably pair Uraraka with Tsuyu because if Uraraka rides on Tsuyu's back, if she somehow drops off then Tsuyu is the most likely to catch her because of her tongue. The only non-conductive person in 1A is Kirishima, but since neither of the two of them is really good at plans, Kaminari and Kirishima have a 50-50 success rate. Sata's mental facilities decrease as he gets stronger, so pairing him with Momo seems like a good idea, but then she might have to do extra work. Plus, Sata might not be agreeable when he's stronger, so any plans wouldn't work if that's true. Satu would add extra power to Momo, and provide time for her to create more objects. Jiraiya could use her jacks to locate villains and then send Tokoyami after them, but there isn't a lot that they can do for each other other than that. Izuku's voice became quieter and quieter as he spoke, and eventually became a low mutter by the time All Might had finished writing down all the names Izuku had listed. All Might coughed without blood this time to get Izuku out of his stupor. It worked, and Izuku snapped his head upwards, removing his hand from his lip in the process. Thank you for sharing your thoughts, my boy. Your classmates have listened to your feedback and will surely take it to heart. Izuku didn't process the rest of the sentence. He had an audience? He hadn't realized that the class was listening. What if he'd said something wrong? Or offended someone? His shoulders curled inwards as he imagined a look of disgust on Uraraka's face, or one of contempt on Tokoyami's. He just made friends, how could he have already messed it up? His downward spiral was stopped physically and mentally by All Might's hand on his shoulder. Izuku trailed his gaze from the thin hand up to his teacher's concerned face. All Might's mouth was moving but the sound was muffled, like a blanket or some other bed necessity was placed over him. Or it sounded like that until Izuku's ears suddenly started working again. It was similar to when you press the button to turn in the car radio and a song comes on too loud. Okay, my boy? Why, Izuku stuttered out after he got his bearings back. I'm okay. So sorry. All Might looked a little skeptical, though that might have just Izuku assuming the worst. He wasn't sure, but he let go of Izuku's shoulder. Without realizing his actions, once All Might's hand was gone, Izuku's replaced it. He scratched at the spot where he was touched as All Might started speaking again. As long as you don't feel the need to visit Recovery Girl, then we're done here. Please remember to stay after class, as the teachers wish to speak with you. All Might changed forms between sentences, and then proceeded to sprint away. Izuku was left alone in the room, a little confused, before realizing that his classmates had started to burst through the door and All Might had probably been running away from them. Izuku almost had time to laugh before he was swarmed, and found that when you noticed something about people, everyone wanted to take advantage of that. At least they were nice about it. Deku, I'm not even working with Invisibitch. For the most part. The rest of Izuku's classes flew past his mind. The curriculum was different than it had been at his high school, so it wasn't like he understood most of it anyways. Still, his head felt uncomfortably empty as he waited outside the teacher's lounge. His nerves at being late were slightly more prominent than the ones at being too early, so he had some time to spare before the meeting was supposed to happen. Izuku contemplated the choice between standing awkwardly next to the door for the next few minutes or sitting down against the wall. The wall won out, and Izuku placed his bag next to him as he slid down it. Relaxing fully with his head tilted back, Izuku felt his eyelids grow heavier and heavier. His last thought was along the lines of, "Hope it's not another nightmare," before Izuku's consciousness slipped and he fell asleep. It was this one again. Izuku registered that he was dreaming. He knew, and yet he could do nothing as the similar scene played out. He hadn't had this particular nightmare in a while. Izuku had crouched over his computer as he typed frantically. The screams of the villains, they looked closer to creatures, and that was what Izuku suspected they were, had beat against his temples so hard that he had to clench his teeth to keep them from chattering. He had to focus. Someone was attacking Hosu, but how was he supposed to help if he couldn't even keep his teeth still? Izuku sent the same message describing the situation in Hosu to as many heroes as he could remember. All Might had been one of the first, but Izuku didn't know where he was at the moment. Most of the creatures seemed to be attacking public spaces, so he'd sent the heroes to the ones they were closest to. It was exhausting, and his finger joints had ached when he was done. It didn't matter though, because he still had work to do. He still needed to help. Here it comes. There was a scream. It was different than the others. It wasn't feral or even scared. It was angry. And it was enough for Izuku to tuck his computer under his arm and run towards it. What had he expected to do at the time? Run in with some powerful quirk and beat up the bad guys, like he'd wanted to do when he was younger? Izuku still didn't know, and didn't necessarily want to either. He didn't remember the search well, but he remembered the twisted ankle and the feeling of dread when he'd finally found the right alley. That was the thing about dreams. A person couldn't remember what street they'd been on, but the pure fear coursing through their veins was clearer than stars on a cloudless night. The Vigilante? No, the title didn't quite fit him. Izuku was a vigilante as well, but he was different. He hoped he was. Stain had someone under his blade, and he appeared to be monologuing. Izuku's ears were ringing from barely concealed panic, so he hadn't caught anything that said, although he doubted that he would have wanted to anyways. He had directed the closest heroes that he could find to the location before doing anything else. Now he just had to wait for them. He didn't need to get involved, didn't need to do something stupid. But he always did, didn't he? No. All it took was a raised blade, some eye contact, and Izuku had yelled as loud as he could. Izuku regretted a lot of things, but he'd never quite regret doing this. He hadn't registered the sound of his feet hitting the pavement, and he felt like he was going to cry and scream at the time, but he had staggered forward anyways. "I won't let you hurt him." Stain had turned, face neutral, and Izuku barely had time to trip backwards before Stain was in front of him. "Are you another fake?" Stain had been close enough to Izuku that he had been able to smell his breath. The scent of blood from his mouth had been so intense that Izuku had felt like throwing up. Or another child, trying to play hero. Izuku wasn't sure what made him do it, what made him, a quirkless kid with no fighting experience, swing his fist at Stain. His brain had been far past Mercury in that moment, though, so maybe that was an excuse. The fist hadn't connected, of course, some part of him knew it wouldn't, but Stain had backed up. The punch, if it could have been called that, had forced him back at least. Maybe things would go the way he planned, for once in his life. They never did. Why did he still trick himself into thinking that they would? Stain had smiled. No, All Might smiled. Stain had bared his teeth as he looked down at the laptop Izuku had dropped after his punch. It had sent chills from his teeth to his toes, and he hadn't moved an inch as Stain kept talking. "You're different," he had said almost happily, the same manic look on his face the whole while. "You're like me, aren't you? You actually help people, don't you, antivirus?" His chuckle haunted Izuku to this day. That's why society is so messed up. You help people and don't get thanked, don't get paid, some people even hate you for it. We're alike, aren't we? He had walked forward as he talked, blade dragging behind him in a low whine that made Izuku want to cover his ears and curl into a ball. He had barely registered the person on the ground yelling at him, "Run! Get out of here!" even though the words still rang through his mind every once in a while. When he had finally returned to his previous place in front of Izuku, his smile had widened as he spoke again. "We're both just trying to help." The rest of what had happened next was a blur to Izuku. Sometime after what Stain had said, his brain had just shut down. He remembered being escorted by the heroes in HNCFFS matching Stains when the heroes arrived right in time, and he remembered those same cuffs being broken by Stain when his practically limp body was almost carried off by one of the creatures. He remembered running until he couldn't feel his feet, until he couldn't feel anything. Until all there was in his life were rooftops and alleyways that didn't matter, didn't mean anything. He threw up in a dumpster out back from a convenience store, lost in the world and his mind. The nightmare ended earlier than it usually would have. He hadn't even gotten to the part where his mom had fretted over him, or how the news had reacted to him. Maybe it was for the best, though. Those hurt in different ways than bleeding feet ever could. Back to the present, Izuku blearily looked up at the person standing over him. Aizawa looked contemplative, and maybe a bit concerned. Izuku looked down at his hands. His nails had pressed hard enough that his fingertips were numb and aching. He rubbed the red marks on his legs as he tried and failed to look Aizawa in the eye. Aizawa sighed once he noticed the lack of eye contact. "Come inside when you're ready," he said flatly, but not uncaringly. It almost sounded so. But Aizawa wasn't soft, so Izuku brushed the thought aside. A second after Aizawa had walked through the door, Izuku followed suit. He peeked around the door uncertainly, and promptly felt a little bewildered at what he saw. He wasn't sure what he'd expected to see in the teacher's lounge, maybe organized desks with teachers' grading tests, or something in that vein. He hadn't expected Midnight leaning as far as she could to touch Present Mix's hair, All Might crouched over a Teaching for Dummies book, and even Nedzu with over 15 cups of tea in front of him, all untouched, Izuku noted. Present Mike was the first person to notice him. He seemed surprised enough that he fell backwards in his chair that might not have been entirely Izuku's fault, though, as he'd been leaning back to attempt to escape Midnight anyways. The loud smack from the fall set off a chain reaction amongst the teachers. All Might hid the book he was reading in his jacket, not very successfully, but Izuku gave him points for trying. Midnight pouted as she sat back at her desk, and Aizawa slowly rested his head in his hands with a sigh. Izuku felt bad for Aizawa for a second, but the glare his teacher sent to present Mike made him shift his concerns. Midoriya, my boy." All Might tried to smile. "Thank you for joining us, Dash." He cut himself off with a cough, and Aizawa sighed again. Since you haven't seen any news outlets lately, Izuku wanted to tell him that it wasn't his decision to not allow Izuku to have any sort of electronic near him, but kept his mouth shut. "You're unaware of the fact that your being here has been made public knowledge." "Several people have." Aizawa's lip curled a bit. "That suggested we use you while we still have the chance, as I heard the second top hero put it. Tomorrow, a few pro heroes will take you out of school and on a mission to help track down a drag gang. After the mission, you'll be back here again. The only pro hero from UA that'll be accompanying you will be 13. Aizawa closed and opened his eyes briefly before continuing. "Endeavor, Prophetess, and Vania will be with you as well." Now that that's out of the way, Dash, Aizawa straightened up, and the tense air that seemed to have surrounded him dispelled. "Midoriya Inko is here to see you." Izuku almost didn't catch the last part of what Aizawa said, but when he did, his previous nerves died down a bit. They were still there, of course, just much more calm than before. He'd revisit them later, anyways, probably in the middle of the night. Happy now that his thoughts were a bit more in order, Izuku opened his mouth to ask Aizawa a question. He didn't end up saying anything, though, as Aizawa had already passed out against his desk. Izuku looked to All Might for help, and the man provided it, but not before quickly putting his book away again. "Mrs. Midoriya should be outside now," he said a little nervously, and Izuku didn't blame him. Inko could get scary when she wanted to, Even the greatest villain of all time would be a little cowed in the face of her wrath. The meeting with his mother wasn't very noteworthy. She asked him more questions than he could answer. Are you eating enough? Do you need more clothes? Has Katsuki been treating you all right? And he responded to the best of his ability, which was to say, very poorly. At least Inko hadn't started crying yet. After around half an hour of Izuku and his mom consoling and questioning each other, All Might coughed once or twice, without blood, thankfully, to get their attention. He seemed awkward once he had both of their gazes trained on him, but explained that it was getting a bit late, and that Izuku needed his rest. Oh! Inko gasped, wringing her hands slightly. I completely forgot about the time. I'm sorry. I should probably get going as well. Izuku was quick to comfort his mom. It's not too late, Mom. It's only, Izuku checked his watch, but made a noise of confusion instead of finishing his sentence. His watch seemed to have stopped at 1 p.m., and the darkening sky outside certainly contradicted that. Is something wrong? Inko inquired, leaning forward in concern. And no, Izuku gestured to his wrist. My watch is broken. Inko gently made to grab for his wrist, and Izuku let her. She turned his watch over in her hands after removing it, and with a few tweaks to the knobs on the sides, she had it fixed. There you go, she said cheerfully, glad to help Izuku even if it was in a small way. After his watch was fixed, Izuku said goodbye to his mom and walked back to the dorms on his own. After a few moments of walking, an eerie feeling settled on his shoulders. It felt like several pairs of eyes instead of just one. Izuku stopped walking and listened carefully. He couldn't hear any footsteps, but still. Izuku whipped his head around instead of running in the other direction like he definitely should have, adrenaline making his hands shake slightly, only to blink slowly at the cluster of birds behind him. Izuku let out a breath, feeling slightly hysterical. He'd been unnecessarily paranoid for the past few days. The nightmares were a bit more frequent, so they were probably the cause of his paranoia. As Izuku calmed himself down, the birds seemed to no longer find him interesting. One cawed loudly enough to snap him out of his self-examination, and Izuku watched as the birds flew away in one big group. He could hear their wings beating, but against the newly darkened sky, it was almost like the birds had never been there. Today was the day. Izuku had gone to sleep late the night before and woken up early. 5:30 in the morning had been the farthest thing from fun he'd ever experienced. The sky was dark as he attempted to brush out his hair, so his movements were much more sluggish than usual. He got roughly the same amount of sleep as Shinso, but he normally didn't show it. This morning, though, Izuku was tired, both physically and mentally. Perhaps he could take another nap after the mission? Shinso didn't seem to have a problem with cuddling, so maybe. It didn't matter at the moment. Izuku had left the dorm building with an escort, of course. They still didn't quite trust him, although he didn't blame them for it. 13 looked much less tired than Izuku was feeling, but he couldn't really tell through the costume. About an hour ago, and other than his one companion, no one else had been awake when he left. Hopefully Aizawa would explain everything to the class. 13 wasn't talkative right off the bat. They seemed nice if he was going off what he had seen from interviews, and boy had he seen a lot of interviews, but they were just walking silently at the moment. Maybe 13 was just tired? Or they could hate him with every fiber of their being. It wouldn't be the first time. Heroes were tricky like that. Should he say something? But what would he say? He could ask a question about their hero career, but what if they didn't like to talk about it? Maybe he could just walk in silence. Then he wouldn't have any chance of messing something or everything up. You can ask me anything you want, 13 said with humor apparent in their voice. Izuku squeaked, and promptly felt like repeatedly punching himself in the face. Why did his muttering habit always seem to pop up at the worst times? After seeing his embarrassed state, 13 laughed a little and tried coaxing him to ask a question or two. Probably a mistake on their part. Once Izuku got going, it took a lot to slow him down. Why did you decide to go into rescue work? Do you think that you could try combative work if you wanted to? What are some of the main drawbacks of your quirk? Does it not work on anything? What does it not work on? Have you ever tried using it on a person? Do you know where the things you SCK up go? Have you ever been inside your black hole? Has anyone else? What's it like dash? Izuku stopped his impromptu interrogation when he noticed how 13 had stopped walking entirely as a result of trying to keep track of all the questions he'd fired off. White-hot embarrassment made him sputter out apologies as quickly as he could, even as 13 tried to calm him back down. One of his flailing hands almost hit the hero in the face, and Izuku felt even more of a need to just curl up and die than normal, which was, to say, a lot. After a few minutes of floundering from both parties, 13 and Izuku managed to have a semi-normal conversation. I haven't tried using black hole on a human before, they said thoughtfully, hand held to where Izuku assumed their chin was as they walked. Ah, and maybe an animal then? Not since I first started out. The conversation continued until the pair reached the front of the school. They'd walked relatively slowly as they talked, so it took a lot longer than Izuku had thought it would to walk across the campus. When the UA gates opened, Izuku and 13 were greeted by a simple black taxi. Izuku couldn't see the driver from where he got into the back seat, but 13 seemed to be talking lowly with them, so Izuku assumed that the person wasn't a threat. After the frankly boring car ride, there were only so many times you can hear a song on the radio before feeling the urge to commit homicide. Everyone arrived at Endeavor's agency. The structure was dark, from the tinted windows to the imposing atmosphere. Still, if Izuku looked closely, he could see remnants of the inspiration for the design. All Might's building wasn't something he'd forget easily. The distant thought of All Might kept Izuku's nerves at bay as he and 13 walked through the building. So far, other than the indecipherable looks his companion had been sending him, Izuku hadn't been given anything since getting up that same morning. The fact that he had no idea of what was about to go down was unsettling, to say the least. The elevator ride up wasn't exactly awkward, but the music certainly didn't do him any favors. When the pair finally got to the right floor, Izuku let out a breath. The only people in the conference-like room were two familiar heroes. Endeavor was nowhere in sight. Izuku may have just been putting off the inevitable, but the absence of his least favorite hero was comforting. 13 went to get something they didn't exactly specify, though that might have just been because of Izuku's out-of-it mindset at the moment, which left Izuku alone with the two heroes. The one in pink-tinted armor spoke first. "They didn't tell us you were so young." She turned to the woman next to her, who was already looking tired. "He's gotta be maybe 14, definitely." The woman in the dark green dress elbowed her carefree companion in the ribs, and promptly looked like she regretted it, as the metal plating made a low ding when she hit it, before commenting in a long-suffering voice. "At least introduce yourself to the kid," she whispered, combing her short hair back with one hand. "Ah." The one in the armor turned back towards him with an apologetic look. "I'm the foreseeing hero, prophetess, and this is Vinia. Sorry for this whole thing, didn't know how young you were." She frowned after she said the last part, but didn't say anything more. After seeing that prophetess wasn't going to continue, Vinia sighed. "We can't give you any details on the mission yet, so don't try to ask. We don't know anything either." Izuku noticed her twirl a black band around her ring finger, and spoke before his mind caught up to his mouth. "Are you two married?" The question hung in the air, before prophetess laughed loudly and slung an arm around Vinia. "You betcha. 3 solid years." Vinia sighed again, but she leaned in to prophetess touch all the same. The two of them looked comfortably in a way that made Izuku feel like he didn't belong. Still, the way they smiled at each other made Izuku smile. Too, the air felt warm and cozy as prophetess tried and failed to hip bump Vinia. The atmosphere was jarred abruptly when the door slammed open. The rebound from when it hit the wall made Izuku flinch, and he turned towards the person walking through quickly. Once he recognized the face, he bristled, enough no one seemed to notice. Endeavor stalked in like the ground had personally offended him, though Izuku wouldn't be surprised if it had in some way. His eyes roamed the room, but when he finally seemed to find Izuku, he didn't physically react much other than a minuscule curl of the lip. Luckily for the both of them, Endeavor didn't speak to him. He did bark out orders to the sidekicks that followed him inside, and before long, a map was set out on the retractable table as everyone got to work. Each point and mark was decided carefully, with much discussion, as a plan was made. Or so he hoped. Due to security authorization issues, He wasn't allowed to help or even know half of the planning that was going on. At the moment he was sitting with crisscrossed legs just outside the door. At least he didn't have to look Endeavor in the eye. Izuku's hands shook, so he stuffed them in his hoodie pocket. He would try to calm himself down, and then a few minutes later, an image of Todoroki smiling quietly at one as antics filled his head, and he'd get angry all over again. Todoroki didn't deserve the things that had been done to him. No one did. It had been an accident when Izuku had first tried to contact Endeavor. He hadn't meant to snoop, and yet the first video left open had just seemed. It took little convincing himself to click it, and now here he was, holding a grudge against the second top hero for something that didn't even affect him. His mother always said he had a big heart. Izuku hunched over as he brought his legs closer to his chest. A few breathing exercises, and the sparks inside his throat calmed down to embers. As long as Endeavor didn't try to talk to him, he'd be fine. Probably. Was it illegal to slap a pro hero? After maybe half an hour of stewing in his own rage, Izuku had toned it down to a low simmer by the time Vania beckoned him back in. He didn't meet her eyes and curled in on himself a bit. Vania thought he looked meek until she saw his eyes. The fire behind them was anything but. Neither of them said anything. Izuku's back hurt. It was a dull pain, starting from the base of his tailbone and making its way up. He'd been sitting in the same chair for over 2 hours, and it was taking effect. He thought back to the moment when he'd been walked back inside the conference room. We need to secure the target's dash. No names were said in front of Izuku. It was getting a little tiring, while still making sure they're unaware of being trailed. There should be cameras here, and here dash. The sidekick pointed at different locations that Izuku tried to remember, so we should be able to track the group using these ones. He crossed off all but 3. Izuku blinked at the map slowly. Before he could open his mouth to ask how they expected him to track a group of over 10 people with 3 cameras, Endeavor interrupted him. Those cameras are private property. Feel lucky that we've managed to get you the ones you have. Izuku took care to keep his gaze fixed on the ground as he took in the explanation. It made sense he'd violated more privacy laws than he could count, but it had never really affected him before. It made him feel small, which, now that he thought about it, he really was. Anyways, the sidekick continued on after the awkward pause, we have 1 mole inside the group. We know where they're going and where the drags will be sold, so we just need to make sure nothing else happens. He snuck a glance at Izuku, but started when he saw him looking back. You don't do much, sorry. Izuku tried to smile comfortingly back. As far as he'd gathered from the mission, he didn't have that big of a role. They didn't trust him with private property, they didn't trust him with the names of their targets, and they didn't trust him with any details about the case, so he couldn't have done much if he tried. So Vania will be paired with Endeavor, and Chopper will go with Dash. Izuku turned back into the conversation just in time to hear something that made absolutely 0 sense. What? Slipped past his lips quietly, but apparently not quietly enough, as Prophetess had stopped the talking going on. There were too many eyes on him as Prophetess asked him what he was getting at. I am the Vivines, they'll burn. They'll burn because they're, organic, I each think. Izuku breathed in as he looked down. There was silence before Endeavor directed a flurry of angry words at Vania like it had somehow been her idea to pair with him. She took it with an unperturbed stance, and Izuku felt envious of the way she simply leaned back, unimpressed, with Endeavor's fury focused on her. He probably would have just melted from the flames. After Izuku's brief input, the group glanced at him a bit more as they talked. They didn't ask his opinion on anything, but they looked like they wanted to, and that was what counted. It did make him feel a little better when Vania nudged him before whispering a question or two to him, but that was besides the point. He hadn't gathered much from the meeting as a whole. There was a meeting that was going to be held. He'd heard something about drags, so maybe this was just a drags bust? That didn't explain the surplus of heroes, though. So something more than that, but what? No one would tell him. How we lookin', lil guy? Prophetess' voice spoke through the phone they'd provided him. He still hadn't been given his own back, which created some problems, but he could survive without it. Maybe. Okay, he mumbled as he clicked the keys on the small laptop they'd given him. They're moving, slowly. Distantly he heard a faint, he's so cute, can we adopt him? Followed by an exasperated, no, we can't, but he chose not to comment on it. His cheeks were red, but they couldn't see him, so it didn't matter anyways. Izuku tuned out the other noise coming from the joint call. Why the heroes didn't just use earbuds was beyond him, and focused back on the several windows he had open. The first one didn't have much going on. It was more of a rooftop view than anything else, good for catching anyone trying to fly away, bad for just about everything else. Still, he left it open in the top left corner and glanced back at it every minute or so. It didn't hurt to leave it there, after all. The second was set up above an alleyway. It was also empty, but according to the position of the person he was tracking, it wouldn't be for long. The last window he had open was a map. There was a red dot that was slowly making its way across it. Supposedly, that was the spy they'd sent in. The person who Izuku still didn't know anything about had a phone on them, which was all Izuku needed to set up a tracker. Those were the only screens he had access to. It was a severe downgrade from his usual network, but at least he was still helping. Out of curiosity, and maybe a bit of boredom, Izuku looked through other electronics in the area. There weren't any other than the occasional laptop or phone in an apartment building nearby, and the planted phone was the only one anywhere near the moving group. It was a little strange, but he brushed it aside. It made sense to not carry phones for something like a drag deal. They'd probably come empty-handed save for their goods. Izuku looked at the window with the alleyway, and hastily spoke to the phone again. The there in the alley, still slowly. You have maybe 3 minutes. There was a shouted, finally, from the other end, and Izuku smiled weakly as he kept typing. Hopefully, now all he had to do was sit back as everything played out. He watched the heroes closely. The plan wasn't bad, really. The heroes would follow the group inside the warehouse, lock the doors behind them, and handcuff everyone else. His part wasn't very big at all, to be honest. He was in charge of closing the doors and tracking the targets, and that was about it. At least he had less of a chance to mess up. The heroes seemed to think that his part was bigger, though he wasn't really sure why. Once Izuku had finished locking the doors, he was able to take his hands off the keys. The joints creaked a bit as he stretched them, but his focus was still on the screens. Something was off. The dealers were too docile. They accepted the HNDCFFS without much struggle, and they simply sat bored as the heroes rounded the rest of them up. The final thing that unsettled him was when the mole they'd had in the group turned and smiled directly at the camera on the wall. Izuku was snapped out of the staring contest when shouts came from his phone. He roughly rubbed his scar. It was a nervous tick as he tried to get a word through, but most people seemed to be saying the same thing. Unlock the door already. That didn't make much sense, as Izuku had only locked the door for maybe a minute or two. It should be fine by now. Shaking his head, he leaned back over the keys. Not checking the screen too much, Izuku broke through the walls he'd set up with a few keywords, and the doors opened themselves. That was what should have happened, anyway. Instead, nothing he typed had an effect on the codes he'd gotten through just 5 minutes prior. It was almost like the keys had ceased to work, and he could have just clicked any of them to the same effect. A slimy feeling ran from his stomach to his throat as he tried to talk into the phone. It went abruptly quiet as he told them about how things weren't working, but when he finished, the line was still noiseless. The shouts were non-existent, and even if he held the phone all the way up to his ear, he heard nothing. The air was silent and suffocating as Izuku tried to breath his way through an oncoming panic attack. He couldn't hear the breathing of the single hero left to guard him even if he concentrated. It had been Endeavor's idea to take most of the heroes inside the warehouse, though no one told Izuku why it was necessary at the time. Sitting in the small van with only a laptop and a missing hero to defend himself, Izuku was struck with exactly how little chance he had if someone happened to attack. He almost wasn't surprised when a hand gripped his neck and then all he could see was darkness. The morning felt weird without Midoriya's background presence, in Shudo's opinion. Though the boy didn't say much, he always had a smile ready if you looked his way. Sometimes he even shared the tea that he'd brought himself. He didn't do it often, but if you asked, he would in a heartbeat. Shudo tried to ask Yaoyorozu if she knew where Midoriya was once she'd woken up, but she said she hadn't. Yaoyorozu then tried asking a few more people, but it seemed that no one else had either. The class seemed to move slower without him. It was strange, but Shudo didn't dwell on it too much as he got ready for school with everyone else. His presence still lingered, and Shudo could have sworn that if he turned his head, the other boy would have been sitting near the window like he usually did. Then again, if anyone could ignore unnecessary things like sadness and emotions, it would be him, so the morning passed without incident. Just because the morning hadn't gone horrifically wrong, that didn't make the rest of the day immune. Hanta wasn't an idiot. He was 17th in the class, sure, but he still felt a little justified in forgetting something, or someone, every once in a while. He'd noticed Midoriya's absence as much of the rest of the class, but that didn't stop him from asking the empty desk where the other boy usually sat and asked for a pencil when Aizawa's back was turned. Bakugo had been the one to get in trouble for it. Anyways, he'd boxed Hanta's ear after he'd looked confusedly at the empty seat for half a minute with a furiously whispered, "Dumbass." Hanta wasn't even aware it was possible to whisper furiously, but Bakugo certainly loved to prove everyone wrong. After the whole encounter, the class was quiet again, sans Bakugo, but it felt like it was missing more than one person at the same time. He'd seen the glances Kaminari and Mina had sent him, but he'd just shrugged in response. He wasn't sure of what was going on, and it seemed no one else was either. Ochako felt lost. Not in the literal sense. She was just standing in the cafeteria, waiting. She was waiting for Midoriya, since he had a tendency to hesitate when going to their table alone. She wasn't sure why, but he hadn't explained, so they kept it that way. He usually only took a minute or two to spot her, but she'd been standing for around 4 now and she still couldn't see him. He usually sat with them on Wednesdays if she recalled right. He jumped around a lot from table to table. Tokoyami and Shinso were surprising favorites, and he tended to avoid Bakugo for some reason, but he still kept a sort of consistency. After another minute, Ochako recalled Momo asking around the dorms that morning because she wasn't sure where Midoriya was. Ochako wouldn't have thought much of it, if not for the way Todoroki seemed to be following Momo around the room with his eyes. Although he kept a straight face the whole while, he did seem to care. Then again, Midoriya seemed to have that effect on people. He kind of resembled a capybara in that way. So, feeling a little foolish,